Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something ancient, sacred, steamy and surprisingly academic. You're about to time travel thousands of years into the central heart of ancient India, a place where sex wasn't just something whispered about under bedsheets. It was carved in stone, sung in Sanskrit, and baked right into religion, politics and daily life. Spoiler alert. You probably won't survive this. At least not with your current assumptions intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here for fake love. Also, tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is, just so I know who's out there night owling with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and it's not the world you know. There are no streetlights, no buzz of traffic, no Bluetooth speakers playing lofi beats. Instead, the air is thick with incense and mango blossoms. You're standing in a lush garden behind a grand sandstone temple, the kind with delicate spires and walls sculpted into writhing human forms. Not violent, not vulgar, just alive. Every inch of the temple pulses with bodies curved in pleasure and motion, flesh caught in moments of love, devotion, mischief, and yes, pure unfiltered lust. This is ancient India, somewhere between 1500 BCE and 500 CE, depending on where you want to anchor your soul tonight. You're here not as a passive observer, but as a participant, soaking it all in, what it meant to live in a world where sensuality was part of the spiritual path, and the divine wasn't afraid to get naked. Unlike in much of the modern world, sex here isn't hidden behind locked doors or awkward metaphors. It's in the architecture, in the sacred text, in the rhythm of everyday life. People don't blush when they talk about it. Instead, they revere it. Because to them, sexuality isn't just biological, it's cosmic. You can almost hear the scholars debating under the banyan trees. Is pleasure a distraction from enlightenment or a pathway to it? And that's the first major thing to understand. In this world, sex isn't merely tolerated. It's structured, codified, even elevated. There's a whole branch of philosophy dedicated to it. Kama Sutra, the science of desire. It doesn't just tell you how to do it. It tells you why it matters, what it means, and how it fits into the grand scheme of life goals. You're not just here to survive or to become spiritually enlightened. You're also here to experience beauty, pleasure, and intimacy. That's considered sacred. Now take a few steps with me into a bustling market street. You're in an ancient city, maybe Pataliputra or Ujjain or Varanasi, doesn't really matter. There are flower vendors stringing garlands, poets loudly reciting verses about forbidden kisses, and dancers rehearsing moves that would make modern TikTokers do a double take. Over to the right you see a stone sculpture workshop. One artisan chips away at what looks like a serene Buddha figure. But just beside him, another chisels a scene of a couple mid-embrace, their bodies fluid and expressive. No one's shocked, no one's hiding their kids' eyes, because here eroticism is not so. From the sacred, it's part of it. Quick quirky detour. Some ancient Indian temples were designed with a progression of sculptures, from the outside walls showing highly erotic scenes, to the inner sanctum representing stillness and spiritual purity. The idea? You pass through the chaotic, pleasurable, physical world to reach the divine centre. It's like the soul's journey is a little NSFW at first, but it gets there eventually. And yes, some scholars still debate the deeper meaning of all this. Are the erotic carvings on temples simply there to attract the eye and fund the temple economy? Or are they symbolic of a spiritual journey where human desire is a microcosm of cosmic union? You won't find a consensus, but you will find a lot of very confident tour guides. You wander past an open courtyard where a teacher, a guru, is giving a lesson to a group of curious young minds. They're not hiding giggles. They're asking questions about love, about body language, about the balance between artha, material success, dharma, duty, moksha, liberation, and yes, kama, desire. These are the four purusarthas, the life goals of a well-rounded human existence. The teacher isn't blushing. He's quoting from ancient texts like the Kama Sutra and the Natya Shastra, the treatise on performing arts, which blends drama, dance, and flirtation into one sensual performance. There's a moment where the breeze picks up. The soft scent of sandalwood mixes with something meatier, grilled lentil cakes maybe, and under that scent, there's something more primal, the quiet understanding that in this culture, you live your whole being, No compartmentalizing, no shame in the flesh. You pass a small shrine where a stone lingam, a phallic symbol of Lord Shiva, rests gently inside a yoni, the vulva-shaped basin symbolizing Shakti, the divine feminine. Water trickles over both. Worshippers pour offerings of milk and honey, not with embarrassment, but with reverence. In this act of worship, the masculine and feminine energies are unified. A literal act of balance and creation. It's not a dirty joke, it's cosmology, it's sacred physics. But don't get too comfortable just yet. Because you're also going to run into contradictions, celibate sages who swear off all flesh only to be tempted by mysterious women in the forest. Kings who promote sexual freedom for their citizens but jealously guard their own queens. You'll meet poets who describe every inch of a lover's body with decadent metaphor, and ascetics who warn that desire is a burning chain dragging you back into the cycle of birth and rebirth. You see, ancient India is not one thing. It never was. It's a swirl of religions, philosophies, languages, and contradictions. A place where people build temples with erotic carvings, and then go meditate under a tree for 20 years. A place where sexual pleasure is sometimes your ticket to divine union, and other times your biggest obstacle. And as you sit down under a flowering tree with the soft hum of flutes playing in the background, one thing becomes clear: sex in this ancient world is never just sex. It's power, it's ritual, it's art, it's politics, it's protest, it's the unspeakable made sacred, and the sacred made shockingly human. So settle in, because this isn't going to be a linear, one-size-fits-all story. This is going to be sensual, contradictory, messy, poetic, and utterly fascinating. You've probably heard of the Kama Sutra, right? Let's be honest, just hearing the name probably summons an image or two. Maybe some kind of acrobatic bedroom Olympics, twisted limbs, incense smoke, and a copy of it hidden in your aunt's bookshelf, wrapped in plastic like a taboo artifact. But the truth is, whatever picture the modern world has painted of this ancient text, yeah, it's basically fan fiction compared to the real thing. Tonight you're flipping back through time to understand what the Kama Sutra really is, and spoiler, it's not a sex manual. At least, not the way modern bookstores make it seem. In fact, out of the whole book, less than 20% of it deals with actual sexual positions. The rest? It's more like a lifestyle guide, a philosophical how-to on love, attraction, relationships, power dynamics, flirtation, and, weirdly enough, home decor. You heard that right. There's an entire section on how to decorate your bedroom to make it mood appropriate. You're sitting now in a shaded corner of a scholarly estate, somewhere around 300 CE. Palm leaf manuscripts are being carefully copied by candlelight. A teacher is reciting from the Kama Sutra, written by the sage Vatsyayana, a man who, according to legend, lived a strictly celibate life. That's right. The guy who literally wrote the book on sex supposedly never had any. Makes you wonder, was he the world's first frustrated intellectual? Or was he playing the long game, channeling every ounce of desire into the precision of his words? As you lean in, you start to see the real depth of the text. It's divided into 7 sections. Only one of them is explicitly about the mechanics of sex. The rest reads like an etiquette guide for the emotionally intelligent elite. How to court a woman, how to manage jealousy, how to choose friends, how to behave in public, even how to run a household. It's surprisingly progressive in parts, granting women their own voices, their own desires, even advising men to learn from courtesans on the art of seduction and emotional intelligence. That's not something you'll find in a frat house version of the Kama Sutra, that's for sure. And here's the quirky part. There's a whole section devoted to the classification of kisses. Yes, kisses. The types of them, the intensity, the social meaning. Kisses as a kind of language. Vatsyayana wasn't just mapping the body, he was decoding emotional nuance, which somehow feels more intimate than any diagram of physical positioning. Now, of course, modern scholars have argued endlessly over the origins and intent of this text. Was it just a manual for the elite, disconnected from the common person's experience? Was it meant as a spiritual tool, or a deeply coded satire of social norms? One theory suggests the Kama Sutra was deliberately composed in high Sanskrit so only the most educated could access it, making it more of a secret social blueprint than a casual read. You glance to your left and catch sight of a young woman reading a palm leaf copy of the text. She's not giggling or hiding it. She's engaged, studying, nodding at the parts where Vatsyayana breaks down not just what to do in a relationship, but how to be in one. There's a level of maturity to the work, a deep acknowledgement that sex without empathy is just gymnastics, and that relationships without mutual respect are a waste of everyone's time. But don't get too swept up in the poetic glow of it all. There are parts of the Kama Sutra that feel, well, dated, patriarchal, even a little manipulative. It advises women to use charm and trickery to keep a man's heart, and often presents relationships in terms of power and conquest. And while it acknowledges the existence of same-sex desire and gender fluidity, more on that in a later section, it still largely centres the male gaze. Still, in its cultural context, the Kama Sutra was remarkably bold. It wasn't just about sex, it was about living beautifully. Think of it as a user manual for being sensual, not just sexual. It told you how to dress for a date, how to recite poetry under a banyan tree, and when to strategically apply perfume behind your ears. It told men not just to pursue women, but to deserve them. And women weren't passive prizes. They had strategies, networks, education, and power. You walk now through a part of the city that feels more lived in, less palace, more polished clay homes. A group of young adults are sitting around a fire, sipping spiced wine and quoting verses from memory. They argue playfully over the merits of different seduction techniques. One of them dramatically recites a line, "When a woman glances sideways while pretending not to see you, that is your first test." Everyone laughs, but there's an art to it. The performance of affection, the rituals of flirting that carry centuries of weight. And just when you think this ancient world is all poetics and pillow talk, you get a reminder this book, and the society it came from, was also classist as hell. The Kama Sutra wasn't written for farmers or servants, it was for the urbane, literate class. The same people who had the luxury of hosting salons about love, or debating the morality of a stolen kiss. So while it might feel universal in tone, it was exclusive in reach. Still, its influence spread. For centuries, the text lived in whispered discussions, temple carvings, and dramatic performances. Even when it fell out of favour during periods of moral conservatism, especially under British colonial rule, the Kama Sutra didn't die, it just went underground, waiting for rediscovery. And then, of course, came the modern misinterpretation. You know, that glossy, overhyped version that turned the Kama Sutra into a novelty gift or a stunt for date night. Pages reduced to positions, philosophy stripped for the sake of spice. Vatsyayana probably rolled in his grave when the Western world turned his meditation on intimacy into a coffee table conversation piece. But tonight, under this soft glow of oil lamps and the rustle of palm leaves in the breeze, you've met the real Kama Sutra. Not a sex manual, but a map of human connection. Not a how-to, but a why-to. You walk away not with diagrams in your head, but with a strange sense of clarity, like maybe love when taken seriously can still be an art form, and maybe sensuality, when unshamed, becomes something more profound than we give it credit for. You wake to the sound of bells, soft, irregular, somewhere off in the haze of dawn. It's a slow start this morning, but the ashram doesn't wait for anyone. Birds are already chattering in the neem trees overhead, and the scent of sandalwood smoke curls through the air like a lazy serpent. You've spent the night in a world unlike the markets and courtyards of the city. Here, in the quiet sanctuary of spiritual seekers, everything moves slower. Quieter, tighter. Ashrams, the spiritual heartlands of ancient India, are where sages meditate, disciples sweep courtyards in silence, and desire is supposed to pack its bags and move far, far away. The goal here is brahmacharya, celibacy, self-control, detachment from worldly things, including sex, especially sex. Your new reality is a long way from the sensuous murals of the temple walls or the playful banter around last night's fires. And yet, here's the secret nobody tells you. Just because everyone says they're celibate doesn't mean they actually are. You sit in a meditation circle now, cross-legged and sun-drenched. A bearded guru leads the chant, his voice so low it vibrates in your ribs. Around you, disciples close their eyes in concentration. But if you peek, not that you would, you might catch the quick glance one acolyte gives another, the quiet smile, the slight fidgeting of hands, as if resisting more than just the urge to scratch an itch. Because here's the thing, ancient Indian spirituality wasn't universally anti-sex. It depended on the tradition. The yogic path of brahmacharya taught that semen was a sacred energy, a life force not to be wasted. For men especially, the idea was that every drop retained fueled spiritual growth. But across the river, in a different sect, there might be a tantric school saying, Actually, no, use that energy, channel it, ride it to ecstasy and beyond. Contradiction? Yep, very on brand for ancient India. You follow a disciple through the shaded walkways of the ashram, your bare feet brushing over cool stone. He's young, serious, says he's renounced all pleasures of the flesh, but later you'll hear a story. Not gossip exactly, more like a whispered historical echo, a tale of a monk who fell in love with a temple dancer, of long glances exchanged during morning offerings, of secret meetings under moonlight under sandal trees, and eventually of the shame that followed, the reassignment to a remote monastery in the mountains. Love, it seems, has never read the rulebook. It's not just legends. Ancient texts like the Jataka tales and Puranas are packed with stories of spiritual men, and sometimes women, struggling with, succumbing to, or transcending sexual temptation. A famous one tells of Vishvamitra, a powerful sage who tried to meditate his way into immortality, until the gods sent the celestial nymph Menaka to seduce him and knock him off his spiritual high horse. Did it work? Oh yeah, not only did he fall for her, they had a child too. So much for transcendence. And it wasn't always framed as failure. Sometimes these stories had a strange kind of forgiveness baked in, like, yes, even the wise stumble. The tension between discipline and desire wasn't an embarrassment. It was expected. Even divine beings had their weaknesses. You just had to keep trying to rise above them, or learn to walk with them. Now you're in a different part of the ashram near the library. A quiet hall stacked with palm leaf manuscripts. A visiting scholar from Nalanda, India's ancient Ivy League, is giving a talk. He's soft-spoken, wiry, his eyes full of midnight knowledge. And he says something that sticks with you. Celibacy is a tool, not a rule, like fire. It can cook your food or burn your house down. It's a metaphor worth chewing on. And here's your quirky twist of the day. Some spiritual practitioners in ancient India believed that too much abstinence could be dangerous, not just emotionally, but physically. Like block up your desires too long and boom, unbalanced doshas, insomnia, madness. The Ayurvedic texts even recommend certain herbs and rituals to cool or ground overactive sexual restraint. So even if you were celibate, you had to manage that celibacy, like a bonsai tree, delicately pruned, not hacked down. You head toward the back of the ashram, where the sun filters through latticed walls and falls on quiet quarters. There's a statue here of a female ascetic, carved in cool black stone. She's serene but not emotionless. Her eyes hold something deeper. Stillness, yes, but also a memory of longing. Women were part of this world too, sometimes as spiritual equals, sometimes as dangerous distractions, depending on who you asked. The Bhakti movement centuries later would explode all that by placing love, and sometimes erotic love, at the centre of devotion. But even now you can feel the early stirrings of that idea. That yearning, directed rightly, might actually lead to the divine. Back in the meditation hall, the chants have shifted. A new sound now, flutes, soft and spiralling. The guru opens his eyes and says, "Desire is like a tiger. If you lock it away, it grows restless. But if you ride it..." He doesn't finish the sentence. He just smiles. The debate over celibacy still rages across time. Was brahmacharya meant literally, zero sex, zero thoughts, full control? Or was it broader, a call to conscious living and responsible love? Some argue that the word itself doesn't mean celibacy in the modern sense, but simply walking with Brahman, walking with the divine. In that reading, it's not about rejection, it's about intention. Sex isn't the problem, attachment is. You step outside now, into the warmer light of midday. The ashram behind you hums like a beehive of quiet devotion, and yet behind the silence, you felt something else, a tension, a current, an unspoken truth, that wherever people try to tame the body tends to whisper back. And maybe that's the beauty of it, that even in the most ascetic corners of the ancient India, desire wasn't just denied, it was grappled with, studied, respected, because to ignore it completely, that wouldn't be spiritual, that would just be dishonest. You're sitting under the flickering shade of a banyan tree now, sipping on something sweet, maybe a tamarind sherbet or a cool sugarcane juice. You can't really tell, but it's hitting the spot. The sun is hot, the air is buzzing with the kind of stillness that only ancient towns seem to master. And you're in the middle of a story. Not just any story, the stories. The ones carved into myth and recited in temples, the ones that somehow manage to be both sacred and scandalous. Let's talk about the gods. Because in ancient India, the divine doesn't play by human rules. Or maybe it does, extra. The Hindu pantheon is filled with deities who love fight, seduce, cheat, flirt, shapeshift into animals, and occasionally, yes, get really, really busy. If you've grown up with the sanitized calendar poster versions of Vishnu and Shiva, serene, aloof, and modest, you might want to brace yourself. Because the original stories? Let's just say, the gods were not exactly celibate saints. Take Krishna, for example. Lord Krishna, butter thief, flute player, divine strategist, and serial heartthrob. He's technically an avatar of Vishnu, but spiritually he's the embodiment of rasa, the essence of aesthetic pleasure. And when Krishna dances with the gopis, the cowherd girls of Vrindavan, it's not a line dance, it's a cosmic seduction. He multiplies himself so that each girl feels she's dancing with him alone. Yes, it's a metaphor for divine love, but it's also sensual, lyrical, drenched in longing, an ecstatic union. Ancient poets didn't hold back. They wrote about embraces under moonlight, shared glances, lips that met in the heat of devotion. You're not just supposed to understand Krishna's love, you're supposed to feel it. Then there's Shiva. Ah yes, Shiva the destroyer. The meditating ascetic, the wild-eyed yogi smeared in ash. But even he isn't immune. In one legend, Parvati, his consort, performs an intense penance to win his affection. After ages of cosmic flirting and some serious perseverance, Shiva relents. What follows is an embrace so intense that the act itself threatens to unmake the universe. Literal world-ending sex. Now that's commitment. And it doesn't stop there. There are tales of Brahma growing heads to keep gazing at his own daughter, yep, that happened, of Indra, the king of the gods, sneaking into another man's bedroom in disguise, and of goddesses who weaponize seduction as a form of divine justice. It's messy, bold, and unapologetically human, or maybe the point is, it's unapologetically divine. In this worldview, desire isn't a flaw, it's a force of nature. You walk past a small shrine now, tucked between a mango grove and a low-slung stone building. It's dedicated to Kamadeva, the god of love and desire. He's often depicted wielding a sugarcane bow strung with bees, shooting arrows tipped with flower petals. Sounds innocent, right? But this guy's arrows don't miss. He once dared to shoot one at Shiva to wake him from meditation, and got blasted into ashes for it. No pressure. But Kamadeva's story doesn't end in ash. In later retellings, he's reborn, not with a body, but as a feeling. A scent in the air, a brush of skin, the invisible heat between two glances. You feel him now, flickering at the edge of your awareness, like static electricity in the soul. In a way, it's the perfect metaphor for how the ancients saw desire. Not a sin, but a powerful current that moves through everything. Here's a fun little fringe fact. Some old temple scrolls and regional folk tales tell of gods transforming gender mid-story. Sometimes to seduce, sometimes to protect, sometimes just because. One of the most famous is when Vishnu becomes Mohini, the irresistible enchantress. Not just a disguise, but a full transformation, beautiful, cunning, and entirely capable of causing cosmic distraction. At one point, Shiva sees Mohini and is so smitten, he forgets who she is. Yes, that's Shiva, the very same ash-covered yogi, that moment between them. It's talked about in hushed, ambiguous tones. Depending on the text, it ends in admiration, or something more tactile. This brings you to one of the open debates still echoing in temple courtyards and dusty manuscript libraries today. Were these divine dalliances just metaphors for spiritual truths? Or were they reflections of real social attitudes, approving, even celebrating a more fluid, more complex view of love and sex? Some scholars say it's allegory. Others argue that's just modern squeamishness trying to scrub ancient stories clean. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. Or maybe the truth isn't even the point, the feeling is. You stop near a gathering of travelling bards, Kathakas, who are performing a dramatic retelling of Radha and Krishna. The story spills out in dance and song, longing, union, separation, reunion. It's rapturous. And yet, Radha is not Krishna's wife. Their love is technically illicit, but it's held up as the model for devotional love. Bhakti, because it's love that surpasses rules, love that consumes. Love that blurs the line between sacred and profane, And that's where this divine sexual landscape really shines. The gods in ancient India don't scold you for feeling desire. They embody it. They turn it into story, song, sculpture. They let it be messy. They let it be powerful. And they remind you that maybe your yearning isn't something to fix. Maybe it's something to follow, if not to a lover, then to something even bigger. You sit down on a carved stone bench as the sun begins to sink, turning the sky a slow orange. A group of children runs past, laughing, and one of them waves a handmade idol of Krishna above his head like a kite. Nearby, an old woman strings marigolds into a garland, humming a bhajan that mentions both Krishna's mischief and his kisses. No one flinches. No one says, "That's not appropriate." Because here, the gods are not just worshipped, they're lived with. And their stories, as wild and tangled as they are a mirror. You also realize something kind of uncomfortable and beautiful at once. The gods in ancient India didn't pretend to be perfect, they pretended to be you, or maybe they didn't pretend at all. You're somewhere deep in the jungle now, the kind of place where the trees stretch up forever, and the light barely trickles through. It smells of damp earth, crushed jasmine, and something older. Like incense smoked into the roots of the world. The silence is thick, but it's not empty. You're not alone here, you're walking into a world that breathes differently. Slower, deeper, stranger. This is the realm of Tantra, and no, it's not just about sex. You've heard the word before, probably tossed around in yoga studios or whispered during upscale couples retreats. Tantric massage, tantric eye-gazing. Maybe even someone at a party saying they had a tantric experience that changed their life, which usually just means longer than average foreplay and slightly better lighting. But here's the thing, actual ancient Tantra, it's weirder, wilder, and way less Instagrammable than that. First, let's clear something up. Tantra is not one thing. It's not a book or a guru-approved technique or a sexy set of instructions you can download as a PDF. It's a whole set of spiritual traditions that popped up in India around the 5th or 6th century CE, overlapping with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And while some schools of Tantra do include sacred sexuality, many don't mention sex at all. Some focus on mantra, ritual, meditation, esoteric body maps, visualizations of deities with 1,000 arms and eyes. Some practices are quiet and internal. Others are full-on theatrical, complete with blood, ashes, and skulls. You weren't expecting skulls, were you? Yeah. Welcome to Tantra, but let's follow the thread we came here for, the sensual side. Because among the many schools of Tantra, there's a stream that says this. You don't transcend the body by denying it. You transcend it by diving into it. Your senses aren't distractions. They're portals. Desire isn't your enemy, it's your path. So yeah, in this particular worldview, sex is not a sin. It's not even just pleasure. It's a tool, a sacred technology, a way to merge with the divine. You find yourself now in a small stone chamber lit only by oil lamps. The air pulses with the scent of camphor and rose. A couple sits before a low altar. They're dressed in red and gold, and their movements are slow, deliberate, ritualized. This isn't spontaneous or frenzied. It's sudded, breath synchronized, hands choreographed, eyes locked in a way that feels more like a spell than a stare. They're not just trying to turn each other on, they're trying to dissolve their individual egos and become one not just with each other, but with the entire universe. No pressure. In this form of Tantra, sex isn't about climax. In fact, that's often deliberately delayed or even avoided. The idea is to build energy, to circulate it through the body's energy centers, chakras, and use it to awaken a dormant spiritual force called Kundalini. Kundalini is often visualized as a coiled serpent at the base of your spine. When awakened, it rises through the chakras to the crown of the head, bringing spiritual insight, transformation, and, if you're lucky, maybe a few fireworks along the way. But here's where it gets really fascinating. These practices weren't designed for the general public. They weren't part of everyday temple life. They were kept secret, taught in whispers, passed down only to initiated students. In part because they were dangerous. Not just physically, though. Yes, trying to channel raw energy through your body without preparation can be electrifying in the wrong way. But socially, these were traditions that flipped the rules. They worshipped the body when everyone else said renounce it. They honoured the feminine when society often suppressed it. They use taboo things, blood, sex, even cremation grounds, not to shock, but to remind practitioners that everything in existence is divine, even the things we fear. And here's a weird one for your fringe fact collection. In some tantric rituals, practitioners would meditate in graveyards or smear themselves with ash from funeral pyres. Why? To confront the reality of death. To recognise that the body is temporary but the energy moving through it, that's eternal. Some even performed rituals involving symbolic union with goddesses in these settings. Erotic? Maybe. Terrifying? Definitely. Enlightening? Ask them if they came back. Scholars still argue over the origin and authenticity of these practices. Some say the sexual rituals were marginal, exaggerated by curious outsiders or colonial era scandal hunters. Others say they were central to certain sects, deeply symbolic and transformative, but never meant for mass consumption. There's no consensus. Tantra resists categorization. It lives in paradox. That's kind of its whole deal. You leave the chamber blinking in the daylight. The forest feels different now, like it's breathing with you. You're walking not just through trees, but through metaphors. Everything here means something else. That snake? It's your sleeping potential. That flower? A symbol of your unfolding awareness. That brief spark of longing in your chest? The same force that created the cosmos. It's dizzying and honestly a little exhausting. Because in tantric thought there's no off switch. Everything you do, every touch, every glance, every bite of fruit is part of your practice. There's no normal life and spiritual life. It's all one thing. That's liberating. And also, a lot of responsibility. Imagine having to eat grapes like they're a holy sacrament every single time. Sometimes you just want a snack, but that's also the beauty of it. In a world that so often splits spirit from flesh, Tantra dares to say, why not both? Why not worship through the body instead of despite it? You end the night by a small fire, the forest behind you, the sky above turning deep purple. A tantric verse echoes in your head, one you heard earlier from a wandering sadhu. Within the body, seek the eternal. In the tremble of touch, find the formless. It makes more sense now, but not perfect sense, not linear, rational PowerPoint slide sense, but heart sense, body sense, the kind that lingers like a warmth after a lover's hand leaves your skin. And as you lie back in the grass and stare up at a moon that feels a little closer tonight, you realise something softly radical. Maybe sacredness doesn't start after desire. Maybe sacredness is what desire's been pointing at all along. You're standing at the base of a temple now, barefoot on sun-warmed stone, staring up at carvings so intricate they almost look alive. At first it's overwhelming. Figures upon figures spiralling around the tower like a frieze of frozen motion. Some dance, some battle, sit in serene meditation. And some are very clearly not meditating. In fact, they're in positions that would make your yoga instructor pull a muscle just trying to explain them. Welcome to the world of lingam and yoni, of sacred geometry shaped like sex organs, and temples that wear eroticism like a crown instead of hiding it in the back room under a shame blanket. You're in ancient India's spiritual heartland again, but now you're seeing it with new eyes, because here the human body, especially its most private, pulsing, vulnerable parts, is not a problem to solve. It's a cosmic symbol, a portal, a shrine. Let's start with the Sonyuks. The lingam, literally mark or symbol, is a phallic form often found in temples dedicated to Shiva. You'll see it everywhere, usually nestled inside a smooth, rounded base called the yoni. Together, they represent the masculine and feminine principles of the universe. Not just sex, but duality, balance, and the act of creation itself. Think less dirty doodle and more cosmic USB port, if that helps. The lingam isn't just an object, it's a metaphor for divine energy, rising. The yoni isn't just an opening, it's a cradle for all of existence. And before you roll your eyes, this isn't some fringe belief. We're talking mainstream temple culture. People bring flowers, water, honey and milk to pour over these forms in daily rituals. Whole families, kids, elders, everyone bow before the union of these symbols without the slightest blush. Because here's the twist. These aren't hidden parts of religion. They are religion. You walk around the outer walls of the temple, running your fingers across centuries-old stone. You see couples entwined in pleasure, limbs forming perfect symmetry. Not just mechanical poses, but stories, expressions of longing, trust, surrender, joy. Some amid embrace, some locked in kisses, some caught in what looks like a particularly spirited attempt at levitation. These aren't isolated moments. They spiral up the tower like a ladder of intimacy, leading toward the inner sanctum where the divine resides. And that's the point. You don't get to the god by skipping the body, you ascend through it. Some temples, like the famous group at Khajuraho, take this to full architectural poetry. Built by the Chandela dynasty between the 10th and 12th centuries, these temples are adorned with erotic sculptures that Western visitors have often labelled pornographic. But the truth is, they were never meant to titillate. They're part of a visual philosophy that says enlightenment is not a clean, sexless place. It's messy, sensual, human. The erotic figures aren't just decoration, they're integration. They remind you that you're not supposed to leave your body behind to reach the divine. You're supposed to bring it with you. Still, even in ancient times, there was debate. Some scholars argued these carvings were meant to ward off evil spirits, like sacred scarecrows. Others believed they educated pilgrims about life's stages: student, householder, renunciate, offering a visual manual along the journey. Some even claim the outer eroticism contrasts with the inner purity of the sanctum, a metaphor for transcending the senses. The temple says, yes, you'll pass through desire, but desire isn't the end, just one of many doorways. And yet maybe the boldest idea, that desire is the divine, not something to overcome, but something to understand, to honour, to meet in its full intensity and not flinch. Now for a fringe fact, in some regional traditions, entire festivals are built around the worship of yoni stones, vulva-shaped idols bathed in turmeric, red powder and milk. Women lead the ceremonies. The yoni is honoured not just as a sexual organ, but as the source of wisdom, fertility and cosmic power. In fact, the Devi Mahatmya, a sacred text devoted to the goddess, describes the divine feminine as the force behind every act of creation and destruction. The body isn't just sacred, it is the divine. You sit now at the edge of a temple tank, the water cool against your toes. A priest walks past, humming something under his breath. A child tosses marigold petals into the rippling water. And nearby, a woman lights incense before a small stone lingam shaded under a tree. There's no shame here, no awkwardness, just ritual, reverence. You realise that the sacred here is not tucked behind curtains. It's built into public life, visible, physical, acknowledged. And here's where it gets really interesting. While medieval Europe was busy draping statues in fig leaves and condemning bodies as sinful, ancient Indian temple art was busy cataloguing every possible way humans could touch, desire and find the divine in each other's skin. Not just straight couples either. You'll find depictions of threesomes, same-sex lovers, even interspecies unions, some symbolic, some literal, depending on how deep the metaphor goes. It's like the temples themselves are saying, you think you've invented something new? Sit down, we've been sculpting this into stone for 1,000 years. But again, the carvings aren't just for show, they're teaching tools. Many temples were learning centres too, places where priests, dancers and initiates studied not just theology but poetry, music, philosophy and yes, the Kama Sutra. The carvings, they were the PowerPoint slides of their time, narrative aids, erotic parables, and perhaps even reminders to the monks not to take themselves too seriously. Look, the temple whispers, you are flesh, you are soul, you are both. You get up and walk slowly toward the sanctum. The path narrows, the carvings grow simpler, less carnal, more abstract. Geometric forms replace bodies, the air cools, the light dims. You enter the womb of the temple, the Garbhagriha. It's quiet here, just the steady drip of water, the faint scent of oil, and the dark stone presence of the deity. The carvings were the prelude. This is the pause, the breath, the stillness after. You realise something ancient, something primal, that the body isn't just a vessel to be endured. It's a language, a poem, a prayer, and when it touches another body with love, with presence, with intention, that too can be a kind of worship. So no, those sculptures aren't embarrassing. They're not outdated. They're instruction, reminders, mirrors. They say, this is what it means to be human, to want, to reach, to touch, and maybe, just maybe, to transcend. You're walking down a dusty road now, somewhere between a river and a village school, the kind of place where kids carry slates under one arm and mango slices in the other. A thin cow trots by like it's late for something, and the air smells like tamarind, wet earth, and faint wood smoke. It's peaceful, unassuming. But this little corner of ancient India has something going on that might surprise you, something we rarely talk about when we imagine the past. Sex education. Yes, that's right. In a time before textbooks, before TikTok, even before modern conceptions of childhood and adolescence, ancient Indian societies still found ways to teach the young about sex. Not just the mechanics, but the ethics, the poetry, the nuance, and the awkward, tangled mess of it all. You duck into a shady grove where a small group of teens sit cross-legged on mats. At the front, an older man, white-haired, sharp-eyed, kind of a cross between a grandfather and a philosopher, is reading from a manuscript. His voice flows smoothly, calmly, like someone teaching math or astrology. No weird giggles, no uncomfortable fidgeting, just information. Balanced, respectful, deeply contextual. And what are they learning? Well, not just birds and bees stuff. They're diving into things like karma, desire as a life path. They're talking about courtship, consent, how to read a lover's mood, and the subtle language of gestures. These aren't just biological facts. These are social teachings, how to navigate attraction, power, and responsibility. You didn't expect a culture that carved people having sex into temple walls to be prudish about it in real life, did you? One of the key tools in this early education system was storytelling. You sit under a tree next to the students as the elder begins to recite a tale from the Tantra. The story's about a clever monkey and a vain crocodile, but it's not just a zoo fable. It's layered with sexual undertones, betrayal, seduction, and emotional intelligence. The kids laugh, but they get it. Even the animals are teaching them how love works, how trust is earned, and how desire, when misused, leads to ruin. It's not subtle by modern standards, but it's clever, coded in metaphor and safe enough for public retelling. Of course, formal texts were also part of the picture. Besides the Kama Sutra, there were other treatises, less famous, but still influential. The Anangaranga, for instance, written much later around the 15th century, but based on older traditions, served as a bedroom guide for newlyweds. It wasn't just about technique. It offered chapters on how to build emotional intimacy, how to handle jealousy, even what to do if your partner had different preferences. Imagine that, an ancient culture acknowledging sexual compatibility as part of a healthy marriage, long before modern therapists started charging by the hour. Here's a quirky little fact for your brain's treasure chest. Ancient manuals sometimes even divided people into different categories based on the size of their genitalia and their sexual temperaments. No joke. They used terms like hare, bull, or elephant for men, and deer, mare, or elephant for women, and then matched them accordingly. It's like ancient Tinder, but with a zoological twist and way fewer unsolicited messages. Now here's where it gets complex. While education about sexuality was present, it wasn't equal across the board. Boys were often taught through a blend of oral instruction and philosophical texts, while girls, especially from elite or temple-connected families, might learn from older women, especially those within the courtesan or performance traditions. Mothers, aunts, even nursemaids passed down knowledge, not always in classroom form, but in quiet conversations, stories, rituals, and songs. In the royal courts, where everything was performed, rehearsed, and layered with meaning, young women were trained not just in music and dance, but in the rasa of seduction. They learned how to carry themselves, how to use fragrance, how to read a lover's hesitation or confidence. Not because their value depended on their beauty, but because these were considered skills. Emotional intelligence, a kind of refined literacy in human connection, one that, according to the culture, could be taught, practiced, and perfected. That said, some traditions still pushed back. In more conservative or ascetic schools, the message was don't tempt fate, don't tempt yourself. In these places, sexual education was framed around discipline, the dangers of indulgence, and the virtues of restraint. You'd hear stories of sages seduced by distraction, monks who fell from grace after a single gaze, or kings who lost their empires chasing forbidden pleasure. So yes, the education system was layered, and sometimes deeply contradictory. And that leads us to the scholarly tug-of-war that still plays out today. Was ancient Indian sex education truly progressive? Or was it just progressive for the elite, while the rest were left to figure things out on their own, guided by gossip, custom, and the occasional awkward conversation? The texts we have come largely from urban upper caste circles, but dig a little deeper, and you'll find oral traditions in tribal and rural communities that had their own systems of sexual storytelling, folk songs, fertility festivals, even symbolic dances that acted as silent teachers. Back in the grove, the lesson has shifted to something lighter. The students are practicing the art of suggestion, how to drop hints of love or interest without being obvious. One girl walks past with a lotus flower tucked behind her ear. A boy responds by offering her sandalwood paste for her forehead. It's innocent, maybe even rehearsed, but it teaches something essential. That attraction isn't a blunt hammer, it's a dance. A conversation between two people willing to listen to the unsaid. And as the sun begins to set and the children scatter toward home, the elder rolls up the manuscript, smiles at you, and says something that hits harder than expected. We do not hide the moon when we speak of the sky. Why should we hide desire when we speak of life? You're left sitting there, blinking in the soft gold light, realizing that maybe sex education wasn't just a subject in ancient India. It was a worldview, a framework, a deeply woven understanding that desire is not to be feared, but to be shaped, understood, and, when ready, shared. The silk rustles before you hear the footsteps. A pair of feet, painted, toe-ring deliberate, glides across the marble floor, anklets chiming just enough to announce a presence, never enough to distract. You're in the private chambers of a royal court now, somewhere between the 3rd and 9th century CE, in a kingdom that no longer exists on any modern map but lingers in every red curtain, in every whispered poem, in every slow sway of hips across the polished floor. Tonight, you're in the presence of a courtesan, and if you think that word means prostitute, you're about to get an education. She sits with posture that could shame a statue, her eyes sharp and unreadable behind kohl-lined lids. A veena leans against the wall behind her. On the low table beside him, poetry scrolls, perfume bottles, maybe even a half-finished letter from a prince trying to win her back. Because here's the truth. In ancient India, courtesans, called Gannicus, Veshyas or Nagarvadu, depending on region and rank, were not just objects of desire. They were centres of culture, educated, articulate, powerful, and, in many cases, terrifyingly independent. Let's rewind a bit. While common sex work did exist in ancient Indian cities, and we'll get there later, the courtesan occupied an entirely different social bracket. You weren't born into it, you trained for it. You learned classical dance, music, rhetoric and poetry, you studied perfume making, textiles, astrology and politics. And most importantly, you mastered the art of conversation, the kind that could sway ministers, delay wars, or ruin a man without raising your voice. Courtesans weren't just women who entertained. They were the entertainment, the education, the escape, and the agenda all wrapped in one. You're in her salon now, lit by oil lamps and soft shadows. A young prince is seated near her feet, desperate to prove he knows something about poetry. She smiles, corrects him gently, then recites a verse that leaves him silent. It's not even about sex. It's about monsoon clouds and longing, and the memory of a half-smile. But it lands like a thunderclap. That's the game. Not just arousal, but artistry, emotional fluency, a kind of erotic literacy. You might be wondering, where did they learn all this? From whom? Often from older courtesans. The system was self-sustaining. A woman could enter the profession by choice, by lineage, or by circumstance, but she could rise through talent, wit, and an almost weaponized kind of grace. The most successful among them were given titles, land, even government recognition. Some were paid retainers of the court, others elected as Nagarvadus, brides of the city, chosen for their beauty and talent, not for a husband, but for the people. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In cities like Vaishali, the position of Nagarvadu was so prestigious that it came with official ceremonies, jewellery from the treasury, and guest lists that included kings and scholars. Imagine being so desired that your job was to entertain but never belong to the elite. You were simultaneously celebrated and untouchable, sacred and sensual. But of course, not all stories are rosy. There were risks. Politics shifted, new rulers came with new morals. Sometimes courtesans were revered, other times reviled. Their lives were always dependent on public favour, court politics and economic tides. Even the best could fall from grace. One scandal, one rumour, one war, and the silks turned to rags overnight. Still, for centuries, they carved out a space for female autonomy in a world that often offered women little else. A courtesan could own property, she could refuse clients, she could host salons where philosophers debated topics she chose. And while wives in the upper classes were often secluded behind veils and palace walls, the courtesans moved freely, dressed boldly, and spoke publicly. They were the avatars of Kama, not just in the physical sense, but in the intellectual, artistic, and even spiritual sense. You're watching now as she teaches a younger girl how to walk. Not just walk, but move like water with intention. There's instruction in every motion. Don't look directly into his eyes unless you mean to destroy him. The girl nods. She gets it. This isn't about seduction. It's about control. About understanding that in a society where women were often bartered or silenced, the courtesan had the stage, and she knew how to use it. Naturally, this led to a certain tension. Religious texts and public morality campaigns didn't always appreciate the courtesan's influence. While texts like the Kama Sutra acknowledged and even respected them, others warned against falling into their orbit. They were seen as dangerous not because they were immoral, but because they were free. And scholars today still debate just how much power these women truly had. Were they truly autonomous agents? Or were they glorified entertainers caught in gilded cages? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Their influence was real, but so was the fragility of it. One ruler's whim could spell disaster. But for a time, sometimes a very long time, they thrived in a way most women of their era couldn't even imagine. You step outside now, back into the night air. The courtesan's perfume still clings to your senses. Sandalwood, jasmine, something else unnameable. She's behind you now, laughing softly at something the prince said, her voice as measured and intentional as a musician tuning a string. You walk away with this quiet realization, that in a world often obsessed with control, a courtesan's power came not just from beauty or sex or poetry, but from choice, from the refusal to play by anyone else's rules, from the ability to shape desire rather than be shaped by it. And maybe that's why they were feared, not because they corrupted society, but because they held a mirror up to it and smiled. You wake up in the middle of a royal courtyard. It's not quiet. There are parrots calling in the trees, guards shuffling in the outer halls, a flute echoing somewhere beyond a veil of curtains, but the real buzz is in the air itself, thick with anticipation. You're in the palace of a king, somewhere during the Gupta Empire or maybe even earlier. A golden age, they say. You stretch, shift, and realize you've arrived just in time for one of the strangest, most strategic parts of ancient Indian sexuality, the politics of pleasure. Today's topic: polygamy, polyamory, and the endless power plays that came with them. Because as much as love was about passion, poetry, and soft glances under moonlight, it was also a tool, a weapon, a chessboard with silk-draped queens, philosophical mistresses, and kings who often got more than they bargained for. The king here, let's call him Virasena, is in his late 30s, thick-bearded, philosophical, fond of mangoes and military parades. He has 3 official queens. One's politically married from a neighbouring kingdom, another's a childhood sweetheart, and the third, a former courtesan turned consort, whose sharp tongue has terrified more than one visiting ambassador. He also has at least half a dozen concubines, a few favoured dancers, and, if the whispers are true, a secret lover among the scribes. And this is normal. Because in many parts of ancient India, especially among royalty and elites, monogamy was not the default. It wasn't even the goal. Marriages were alliances, currency, diplomatic shields. Love, if it happened, was a bonus. Lust, expected, managed, logistically accounted for. You walk through the harem complex now, not the Orientalist fantasy with veils and fainting couches, but a more grounded reality. A series of interconnected chambers, each its own small world, with women from various kingdoms, classes, and cultural backgrounds. Some read Sanskrit texts by lamplight. Others practice music, learn politics, or consult astrologers. This isn't just a pleasure dome, it's a court within a court. And the women here, they're not just rivals, they're players. The queen from Magadha is currently planning to secure her son's position in the line of succession. The consort from Gandhara is more interested in poetry and is secretly ghostwriting verses the king claims as his own. And the childhood sweetheart, she's running a charity operation that feeds half the temple dancers in the capital. None of them are passive. All of them are aware that in a system built on polyamorous authority, knowledge is as erotic as beauty. But don't mistake this for freedom. These women didn't necessarily choose their situations. Many were sent by their families, offered up in diplomatic marriages or political exchanges. Their ability to navigate this world, to find affection, protection, or even genuine love, depended entirely on their intelligence, charm, and resilience. Still, polyamory wasn't confined to palaces. In some regions and communities, plural relationships were simply part of the social landscape. There were matrilineal societies, like the Nairs in Kerala, where women could have multiple partners, and lineage was traced through the mother. In tribal groups, polyandry, one woman with multiple husbands, was practiced, often to consolidate land and family resources. It wasn't scandalous. It was pragmatic. Meanwhile, in urban centres, open relationships happened quietly but regularly. Some texts from the Kama Sutra tradition even classified different types of lovers: steady, wandering, curious, indifferent, and recommend strategies for managing overlapping affections. You imagine an ancient love coach in saffron robes offering advice like, if two of your lovers meet at the monsoon festival, serve them both sugarcane and pretend it's a coincidence. Here's a quirky fact. Some temples kept detailed erotic horoscopes for elite clients. These charts helped priests advise people on the optimal timing of affairs, assign lovers based on planetary compatibility, and even warn when someone might be too fiery for your moon sign. Astrology wasn't just about fate, it was about logistics. Now, scholars love to debate this stuff. Was polyamory as accepted as it appears in the texts? Or were those just elite fantasies, far removed from the lived experiences of ordinary people? Some argue that the Kama Sutra and similar writings reflect an idealized urban class, wealthy, educated, pleasure-seeking, and that the average villager lived in more conservative, practical monogamy. Others push back, pointing to regional customs and folk traditions that suggest a far more fluid reality. But one thing's clear, sexual exclusivity was not the measure of love or loyalty. Fidelity, in the emotional sense, meant something different. You could have multiple partners and still be devoted to one above all. You could share your body without sharing your heart, or vice versa. The culture allowed for that complexity, even if it didn't always treat it kindly. Back in the palace, the mood shifts. A new woman has arrived, sent from a southern ally, with a dowry large enough to fund a new temple. She's young, educated, and already rumoured to have turned down 3 princes on her journey here. The existing queens gather to size her up, but instead of daggers and drama, there's calculation. What does she bring? Will she disrupt the balance, or can she be absorbed into the intricate web of influence, turned from a threat into an asset? You watch it unfold like a courtly opera, an unspoken ballet of power, grace, and strategy. No one's throwing wine, no one's fainting. These women know how the game is played. As the sun sets, the king sits with 2 of his consorts in the lotus pavilion. He pours them wine, they laugh. One recites poetry, the other corrects his pronunciation. It's not romantic in the modern sense. It's not nuclear family fantasy. It's something else. A fluid arrangement, a shared power structure, maybe even a fragile kind of harmony. You step away from the scene, head spinning. Not because it was salacious, but because it was complex, emotionally intelligent, politically layered, far more intricate than any modern label could capture. And as you look up at the night sky, you remember something an old scribe said earlier in the archives. In love, as in empire, there is no single crown, only balance or war. You step through a stone archway, and suddenly everything feels brighter, like someone turned the sun up just a notch. You're not in a royal court or jungle shrine anymore. You're in a temple courtyard, midday, with schoolchildren running past, a group of dancers rehearsing in a shaded corner, and a few elders playing something that sounds suspiciously like a very competitive game of dice. At first glance, this seems like any other slice of ancient Indian daily life. But then you look up, really look, and there they are. Again, bodies, lots of them. Sculpted, painted, dancing, entwined, exposed, naked, half-clothed, grinning, moaning, reaching. Some are engaged in what could generously be called interpretive yoga. Others are straight-up mid-coitus, positioned in gravity-defying, spine-challenging ways. And the most surprising part? No one seems to care. No one's covering their kids' eyes. No one's looking around awkwardly. It's just part of the architecture. You've stumbled into the unapologetically naked truth about ancient Indian education. Nudity wasn't shameful, it was instructional. This temple, like many others across India, especially in the places like Khajuraho, Konark and Belur, wasn't just a place of worship, it was a university, a stage, a sacred storyboard, and yes, sometimes a sex-ed classroom, but not in the awkward birds and bees kind of way. This was education through embodiment, through art, symbol and performance. Take a closer look at the carvings. These aren't just orgies for ornament's sake, they're anatomical studies, emotional studies. There's a woman depicted just before orgasm, her fingers gripping a lover's shoulder. There's a man hesitating at the edge of a kiss, his expression caught between lust and reverence. And then there's the aftermath. Posture soft, limbs loose, a gaze that suggests not just pleasure, but profound connection. You're looking at a curriculum in stone. Inside the temple's interior halls, the energy changes. It's cooler, darker, lit by hanging oil lamps and sunbeams filtered through lattice windows. You pass students, both male and female, reciting verses, sketching diagrams, practicing posture and mudras. Some are studying dance, others are learning Ayurvedic principles, and a few, they're literally tracing the erotic carvings with their fingers, murmuring the Sanskrit names of each position, each emotion, each subtle hand placement. Because for some branches of learning in ancient India, especially in the Natya Shastra tradition, education wasn't just about memorizing facts. It was about understanding the body as a vehicle of meaning. Dance wasn't just art, it was communication. Every eye flick, every hip sway, every fingertip held midair told a story, often one involving desire, loss, seduction, or spiritual yearning. And then there were the courtyards used for demonstrations, not live sex acts, let's not get it carried away, but detailed lessons in anatomy, gestures, breathing, rhythm, and even the chemistry of touch. Masters would demonstrate how to perform a kiss on the back of the hand, or how to respond to a lover's hesitation, how to recognize when pleasure shifts into emotional vulnerability, all of it considered worthy of scholarly attention, all of it sacred. Here's a quirky little fringe detail. Some temple schools even had textiles painted with erotic illustrations, basically the ancient version of educational posters. These cloth scrolls, known as chitras, were sometimes used to teach newly married couples how to pleasure one another respectfully and attentively. They weren't mass-produced, and they weren't sold in sketchy markets. They were woven, painted, and preserved with the same care as religious scrolls, because in this culture, sexual knowledge wasn't separate from spiritual knowledge. It was part of the same thread. Still, not everyone approved. Even back then there were voices, priests, reformers, anxious kings, who thought maybe all this nudity and sensual openness was a little too much. They warned against moral decay, against the youth losing themselves in desire. Some temples were defaced or whitewashed during later periods, their sculptures chipped away by the uncomfortable hands of conservatism. But here's the fascinating debate among scholars today. Were these temples ever really meant to teach in the modern sense? Or were the carvings symbolic, intended as metaphors for union, longing, or the many stages of the soul's journey? Are we projecting modern ideas of sexuality onto ancient art that was never meant to be so literal? The answer, as usual, is yes. And also no, because in ancient India, meaning was rarely singular. One carving could be a sex scene, a cosmic dance, and a philosophical metaphor, all at the same time. That wasn't confusing, that was the point. Multiplicity was the default setting. Back outside, you see a group of young women practicing a dance routine in front of a relief panel showing Krishna with his gopis. The teacher corrects them gently, not just their steps, but their expression. "Your eyes must smile before your lips do," she says. "Desire begins in the glance." You nod instinctively, even though you're just an invisible traveller in this moment, a voyeur from the future. But it lands, doesn't it? The idea that sensuality isn't something we hide until it's appropriate, and it's something we learn, with care, intention, and context. A teacher invites you to sit and observe the afternoon lesson. Today's topic is Sringarasa, the aesthetic of romantic and erotic love. The students learn to identify its presence in dance, music, poetry, even sculpture. Not just what is sexy, but why. What makes a glance linger? What makes a touch meaningful? What transforms a physical act into an emotional event? You realise something quietly subversive. These people are being trained not just to love, but to love well. To see love not as chaos or destiny, but as a cultivated art, a skill, a discipline, and that includes the boy, how to treat it, how to read it, how to honour it. The lesson ends. The bells chime. Students roll up their scrolls and brush chalk dust from their robes. You're left sitting in the courtyard, staring again at the carvings overhead. They haven't changed, but you have. You no longer see them as provocative or shocking. You see them as teachers, silent, sensual, sacred. And as you rise to leave, one final thought settles in like dusk. Maybe the real indecency isn't in showing the body. Maybe it's in pretending it doesn't matter. You're drifting now through an incense-thick hallway, the kind where the air itself feels like velvet. There's chanting in the distance, low, repetitive, hypnotic, and someone's burning sandalwood so strong it clings to your skin like a memory. You've just stepped into a space that doesn't separate the sacred from the sensual. In fact, here, the two are married. Tonight, you're exploring one of the most provocative ideas from ancient Indian philosophy, that pleasure can be a path to enlightenment. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? The idea that desire, this thing we're constantly told to resist, suppress, or at least moderate, could actually lead to something higher. But that's exactly what some of the more radical spiritual traditions of ancient India proposed. In their view, the body wasn't a trap. It was a temple. And inside that temple, if you knew how to move, breathe, touch, and love with presence, you could awaken the divine. You're in a tantric hermitage now, but not the dramatic graveyard kind from earlier. This one is quieter, more meditative. A stone courtyard, lotus pond in the centre, and carved mandalas spiralling outward in the floor tiles. The practitioner seated before you isn't dressed in wild colours or covered in ash. She's in simple cotton robes, bare feet, soft voice. Her eyes don't pierce, they invite. She smiles and says, "What you seek is not beyond you. It's already in your skin." You sit and listen. In this branch of Tantra and similar philosophies that bloomed around it, the idea is that union is everything. Not just union with another body, but with the world, with time, with self. Sexual union, when done with awareness, can become a mirror of cosmic union, a rehearsal for the soul's merging with the infinite. In other words, making love becomes a form of meditation. But hold on, this isn't about passion for its own sake, it's not a free-for-all. These traditions are strict in their own way, disciplined, ritualized, and deeply serious. Think long breathing sessions, body awareness drills, eye contact that borders on telepathic. Every movement is intentional, every gesture symbolic. The goal is not orgasm, the goal is awakening. You're shown diagrams now, not graphic but symbolic. Chakras, energy flows, sacred geometry shaped like lotus petals and serpents. The kundalini again, coiled at the base of your spine, waiting to rise. You hear about Bindu, the sacred seed, and how retaining it, not spilling it, is said to build spiritual fire. For men, this often meant withholding ejaculation. For women, it meant directing energy upward through breath and visualization. It's not about denial. It's about containment, like water in a dam, pressurized, controlled, and powerful. And yet the teachings aren't anti-pleasure, quite the opposite. They teach you how to touch without taking, to kiss without consuming, to feel without fleeing. The body isn't a battleground, it's a bridge. Now here's your quirky detail for the night. Some texts describe the ideal tantric union as being so balanced that the couple breathes in sync, heartbeats aligned, both reaching climax at the exact same moment, in perfect stillness. Not shouts, not thrashing, stillness. As if time itself holds its breath while two people dissolve into each other. It's not about fireworks, it's about silence. But don't worry if you're skeptical. Even in ancient times, not everyone bought into this. Some scholars called it indulgent. Others accused it of being a cover for hedonism. A few philosophical schools, like certain branches of Vedanta, flat out rejected the idea that pleasure could lead anywhere except deeper into illusion. Desire, they warned, is the bait that keeps you in the trap. And yet the tantric has countered with something radical. The problem isn't desire, the problem is ignorance. If you know what you're doing, if you approach it with reverence and clarity, then even the heat of passion can burn away the ego. It's not the act, it's the intention. You move now through the inner sanctum where couples once performed rituals together, not always sexual, but always intimate. Massaging oil into each other's skin, chanting mantras in each other's ears, holding eye contact through cycles of breath until the separation between you and me became so blurry it didn't matter anymore. There's a word they use for this, maithuna. It means union. And in its most sacred form, it's not just a physical act. It's an offering, a ceremony, a merging of the two into the one. And you can't help but notice the symbolism everywhere. The merging of sun and moon, breath and body, Shiva and Shakti. These are not just mythological figures. There are the polarities inside you, masculine and feminine, stillness and movement, intellect and emotion. The act of union is a way of harmonizing those forces. When they balance, they unlock something far deeper than just pleasure. They open the gate to liberation. You sit again by the lotus pond, and the practitioner offers you a final thought. The body is not the enemy of the soul, it is the door, but you must knock gently. You let that sink in, because somewhere along the way, the modern world started treating pleasure as a detour, something to be managed, indulged in secret, or denied outright. But these ancient seekers, they walked straight through it. They dared to believe that desire, held wisely, might actually be a spiritual compass, that the body doesn't distract from the divine, it reveals it. So tonight, as you walk back through the now silent courtyard, the moon rising full above the trees, you carry a new thought with you. Maybe you're not meant to escape your body. Maybe you're meant to listen to it, honour it, and when the time is right, worship through it. You're walking beside a river tonight, the kind that curves like a silver thread across an ancient map. The air hums with crickets, and fireflies blink in the distance like distant embers of forgotten stars. This is a different kind of setting than you've seen so far. No palaces, no temples, no carved stone or scholarly scrolls, just the sound of water, the smell of wet earth, and the weight of stories whispered into the dark. You're on the edge of the great epics now, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and tonight you're not here for the battles. You're here for the kisses, the longing, the hidden glances. You're here for the forbidden love. Because behind all the war cries and divine prophecies, these ancient epics are stuffed, quietly, subtly, with sensuality. Not the open, sculpted kind you saw in temples, but the kind that hides in stolen looks, nighttime rendezvous, and metaphors so beautiful they almost hurt. Let's start with the Mahabharata. On the surface, it's the story of dynastic rivalry, of dharma, fate, betrayal, and the blood-soaked battlefield of Kurukshetra. But dig deeper, and it's also a tapestry of intense, often messy, very human relationships. You meet Draupadi, the dark-skinned queen with 5 husbands. Yes, 5. Not just brothers, but warriors sworn to protect and share her. And while modern interpretations sometimes paint her as a passive figure caught in a political arrangement, the original texts say otherwise. Draupadi is intelligent, proud, and emotionally complex. She favours Arjuna the archer, desires him even, but must divide her time equally among his brothers, by agreement, by law, and by cosmic weirdness. There's a moment early on when she catches Arjuna in another woman's room and reacts with fury, heartbreak, and a fire that nearly burns the family down. The epic doesn't shy away from her jealousy. It doesn't condemn it either. It simply lets her feel, deeply, fiercely, unapologetically. Her story isn't framed as a morality lesson. It's a reflection of emotional truth in a world where duty and desire are constantly at odds. And then there's Karna, the tragic hero, burning with loyalty and wounded pride. He's never allowed to fully express the love he holds, maybe for Draupadi, maybe for his own mother, Kunti, or even his friend Duryodhana. The Mahabharata hints at so many emotional undercurrents that never fully surface. It's like watching passion press against glass, too dangerous to open, too strong to ignore. Over in the Ramayana, things are even more tightly wound. Everyone remembers Rama and Sita, the noble prince and his devoted wife, the poster couple for virtue and monogamous love. But when you look closer, their story isn't a clean romance. It's a study in longing and loss. Sita is kidnapped. Yes, but her captivity isn't filled with fear. It's filled with memory, tension, and quiet defiance. Ravana, her abductor, tries everything to seduce her. Wealth, praise, even poetry. But she remains emotionally faithful to Rama. Not because she's weak, but because her love is fierce and internal. A fortress. When Rama finally rescues her, though, it isn't a fairy tale reunion. He doubts her chastity. public opinion whispers like poison, and Sita, in a moment of stunning agency, demands a trial by fire, literally. She walks through her forms to prove her purity, and when that isn't enough, when later suspicions still haunt her, she leaves him. Not in rage, in dignity. She chooses exile. She chooses peace over proximity. That's not weakness, that's power. You sit now by a bonfire near a village shrine where elders are retelling these tales. A child asks why Sita had to suffer. The storyteller sighs and answers, because love is not always enough when the world demands something else. The fire crackles. You can't help but wonder, how many lovers, across centuries, have felt that same ache, that same distance between what they feel and what their world allows? And then there's the love that isn't even supposed to happen. Back in the Mahabharata you meet Bhishma, the warrior who takes a vow of celibacy to fulfill his father's ambitions. But there's this enduring thread, a story not always told about Amba, a princess who loves him and is shattered when he rejects her. Her longing curdles into rage, into obsession, into a vow that stretches across lifetimes. She's reborn as Shikandi, a warrior raised as male, who finally becomes Bhishma's undoing in battle. It's part vengeance, part cosmic rebalancing, part gender fluidity wrapped in epic metaphor. But at its heart, it's a story of a love denied, twisted into fate. And that brings us to the scholars. Oh, the debates. Some say these epics only hint at passion because they're meant to teach dharma, not desire. Others argue the sensuality is deliberately coded, wrapped in metaphor so it could survive the moral filters of later centuries. You can't ignore that these stories were retold again and again, sometimes by poets with an eye for eroticism, sometimes by priests with a broom and a whitewash bucket. But the original texts, they breathe, with pain, with heat, with the messiness of being human in a world that wants you to be divine. And here's your quirky detail for the night. In some regional versions of the Ramayana, Sita doesn't walk into the fire. In others, she and Rama live happily ever after. In still others, she becomes a goddess and ascends, leaving Rama to mourn. Each version tells you more about the society that retold it than the characters themselves. Passion, grief, redemption, reshaped by the lens of culture, era, and audience. You get up from the fire as the storytellers begin a song about Radha and Krishna, not technically part of the Mahabharata or Ramayana, but spiritually connected. Radha, the lover who isn't the wife, Krishna, the god who is always slipping away. Their love is never fulfilled. It's yearning personified, and yet it's held up as the highest form of devotion. Why? Because it asks for nothing. It just is. And maybe that's the deepest thread running through all of these epic romances, the sacred ache of unfinished love, the kiss that almost happens, the embrace interrupted by duty, the love that lives in silence because speaking it out loud might shatter everything. It's not the happy ending we crave, but it's honest and timeless. As you walk away from the river, you realise that ancient India didn't just understand the mechanics of desire, it understood the cost of it, the silence, the sacrifice, the scars, and yet it still chose to write love into its greatest stories. You arrive in Varanasi just before dusk. The city hums like a living thing, ghats busy with pilgrim, priests chanting into megaphones, the river curling like liquid silver through it all. The smoke from cremation fires coils upward, alongside the scent of frying pakoras, marigold garlands, and whetstone. It's chaotic and serene at once, like someone threw enlightenment and temptation into the same pot and forgot to stir. You've stepped into a city that's older than history, where death walks next to devotion, and if you listen closely, sex hums underneath it all like a secret song. Tonight, you're here to peel back the layers of urban myths and nighttime truths in the spiritual capital of ancient India. You wind through the alleys of Varanasi's older quarters, past flickering oil lamps and tiled courtyards, where the walls have heard more confessions than any diary. Every corner seems to whisper stories of lovers, rituals, rebirths, and mistakes made in the name of desire. There's a tension in this place, and it's not just religious. Varanasi is sacred, yes, but it's also earthy, real, intimate in the most unexpected ways. It's a city that knows how to keep secrets. And sometimes it shares them. The first story you hear is from a barber who's been working on the ghats since his beard was barely a rumour. He tells you about a temple dancer who once fell in love with a wandering philosopher a man so devoted to renunciation he swore never to touch a woman. Naturally, that didn't last. She danced every evening at the shrine to Shiva, and one night mid-performance he just walked up and kissed her. In front of everyone. Some say it was the moment he finally understood what transcendence really meant. Others say it was the beginning of his downfall. The temple has since been rebuilt 3 times. That's how Varanasi works. Every spiritual truth comes wrapped in a rumour, every holy man has a shadow, and every alley? 100 stories depending on who you ask. You step into a small tea shop nestled behind the Annapurna temple. It's run by a woman who serves the best masala chai and speaks like she's lived 8 lives. You want the real stories? She asks, pouring the steaming brew into a clay cup. Come back after the evening aarti. You do, and she delivers. She tells you about the silk weavers who, during festival nights, offered fabric not just to deities but to their lovers, tied discreetly around door handles as a sign. About the boatmen who on moonless nights ferried more than just pilgrims across the Ganges. About the ladies of the twilight, women who weren't courtesans or wives but something else entirely, caretakers of loneliness, listeners, healers in the language of touch. These aren't just ghost stories, they're emotional cartography, a map of how people in this sacred city navigated desire without drowning in it. Because in a place like Varanasi, where the divine is literally on every doorstep, sex isn't repressed. It's rerouted, reframed. You don't pretend it doesn't exist, you learn how to carry it like an offering. You walk now through Manikarnika Ghat, where bodies burn on stacked wood pyres, and the line between life and death blurs with every gust of smoke. Here, legends say, Shiva whispers the final mantra into the ears of the dying, liberating them from rebirth. But nearby another legend lingers, a softer one, that couples who make love near the Ghat in the days before parting, or war, or marriage to someone else, will carry a thread of that intimacy into their next life. Not karma exactly, just memory. A priest you meet near the steps tells you, this city is where everything ends, but it's also where everything begins. He says this while casually blessing a pair of teenagers who are obviously trying to act like they're not holding hands behind a pillar. No one scolds them, no one interrupts. The divine is watching, but apparently the divine is chill tonight. And here's your quirky detail. There's an old folk tale about a ghost courtesan named Chandramukhi, said to haunt the Ghats, appearing only to those on the edge of a romantic decision. If you see her reflection in the river, they say, your heart's true desire will surface. If not, well, maybe you weren't ready to know yet. It's hard to tell where the tale ends and the warning begins, but it's told with such conviction that you can't help glancing at the river's surface every few minutes. As night deepens, the city softens. The Ghats empty, the musicians wind down their ragas, lovers drift toward rooftops, and you find yourself in a courtyard where candles float in bowls of rosewater and silence tastes like cardamom. It's here you understand something essential. Varanasi never separates the sacred from the sensual. They coexist, not always comfortably, but they're part of the same breath. People come here to die, but they also come here to love, to touch, to remember who they are before the world told them what they're supposed to be. You meet an elderly astrologer before you leave. He sits beside a shrine counting stars like debts. He says, desire is not a distraction, it is a compass, but only if you know how to read it. You don't fully understand, but it sticks with you, like smoke, like perfume on old silk. So many spiritual systems try to control desire, push it down, chain it in rituals and rules. But Varanasi lets it breathe, lets it sing, lets it whisper through alleys at midnight, telling stories you'll never fully verify, but will somehow always believe. And as you walk back toward the river, the moon just peeking over the horizon, you think, maybe the truth isn't in the temples or the textbooks. Maybe the truth is in the places where no one's watching. In a whispered name, in a glance across a ghat, in a myth you can't prove, but feel in your bones anyway. You're sitting now in a courtyard bathed in morning light, surrounded by columns wrapped in flowering vines and bitterns calling out like they're hearing your thoughts. Somewhere nearby, a conch sounds, rituals begin, but here in this quiet patch of sun-dappled ground, something very old and very radical stirs beneath the surface. This isn't just another story about who loved whom or which prince seduced which poet. Tonight, or rather this morning, you're here to explore something deeper, something that rewrites the rules entirely. Gender identity and sexual fluidity in ancient India. Yes, that's right. Long before modern terms like LGBTQ+ existed, long before political debates turned gender into battlegrounds and identities into hashtags, ancient India had already carved out space, sometimes literal space, for people who lived beyond the binary. And not just space, but stories, roles, gods, rituals, recognition. You're guided now through a shrine that seems ordinary at first, a soft chanting, a few flickering lamps, the smell of ghee and jasmine. But then you notice the deity in the sanctum. Half male, half female, two halves perfectly balanced. On one side, a strong chest and thick dreadlocks. On the other, a curving breast, delicate waist and kohl-lined eye. This is Ardhanarishvara, the lord who is half woman, a composite form of Shiva and his consort Parvati, fused together not in contrast but in divine harmony. And it's not just symbolic. This form wasn't buried in some footnote of mythology. It was worshipped, celebrated, painted on temple walls, sung about in devotional poems, even sculpted into entrances where devotees passed between the feet of the gender-unified divine. It told everyone who walked through those halls, the universe is not one thing or the other, it is both. You turn to a local scholar now, an older woman with a voice like smooth gravel and bangles stacked halfway up her arms. She tells you that in Vedic and Puranic texts, gender isn't a straight line. It's a dance, a spectrum, a shifting energy. The ancient idea of Prakriti and Purusha, feminine and masculine forces, was never about rigid roles. They were about balance, interplay, co-creation, and humans, being divine sparks in bodily form, carried both within them. She flips open a palm leaf manuscript and points to a passage describing Shikandi, a warrior in the Mahabharata born female but raised as a man. Shikandi is central to the battle that eventually brings down Bhishma, the unbeatable elder of the Kaurava clan. And no one questions Shikandi's identity. It's just accepted, strategic, real, embodied. There's no apologetic footnote, no moral panic, just action and consequence like everyone else. And then there's Brihanala, Arjuna, the great archer, when he's forced to live in disguise during the Pandavas' year of exile. He becomes a woman, dresses, lives, and teaches dance as one. Again, no shame, no slapstick comedy, just part of the epic. Gender here isn't locked, it's adaptable, purposeful, fluid. You're led now into a quieter neighbourhood, just beyond the city where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and turmeric. This is where the Hijra community has lived for generations. Today in modern India, they are often misunderstood, marginalised and politicised. But in ancient times, they held a sacred place in society. Hijras, people who identified as neither strictly male nor female, were often revered as third-gender beings with unique spiritual power. They were invited to bless newborns, to sing at weddings, to perform rituals where transitions, birth, death, marriage, needed someone who understood liminality. Because who better to bless transitions than those who embody transition itself? Here's your quirky historical detail. In some medieval courts, Hijras held positions as advisors, guards, even treasurers. The Mughals later on also inherited and adapted this structure. Hijras weren't hiding. They were serving openly, publicly, with dignity. And here comes the debate, of course. Modern historians often argue, were these stories truly accepting, or are we romanticising the past? Was it representation or just spiritual exceptionalism, acceptance only for those who played a ritual role? Did society welcome gender diversity only when it could be wrapped in religious function? It's a valid question, one without a clean answer. But you talk to another elder from the Hijra community, graceful, adorned in gold nose rings, and a sari that glows in the sunlight like it was stitched from marigolds. She tells you we are not a new idea, we are the continuation of a very old rhythm, one the world has forgotten how to dance to polygamy. And suddenly it clicks. You think back to the temples, the carvings, the verses, the metaphors, this entire culture where duality was never a threat, where a god could be both destroyer and dancer, where a man could be a woman for a year and still be a hero, where sacredness was measured not by conformity but by awareness. You sit on the edge of a stone platform now, watching the sky shift from yellow to deep indigo. The peacocks have begun calling melancholy and wild. In the distance a wedding procession begins, and you see a Hijra troupe joining in, drumming and singing. People throw flower petals, No one looks away. No one snickers. It's part of the rhythm, part of the old agreement between body and soul, form and essence, sacred and strange. You're left with this thought. Maybe ancient India didn't tolerate gender diversity, it understood it. Maybe it didn't have to fight over pronouns because it already had deities who answered to many names, and humans who wore many faces across a single life. As the first stars blink into the sky, you realise the most revolutionary thing isn't that ancient India acknowledged more than two genders, it's that it didn't panic about it. It just built the world to include them. You're deep in the forest now, the kind where the trees arch like cathedral ceilings and even the birds sound meditative. The path is barely a path, just soft dirt and patches of moss, the occasional roots snaking across like it's daring you to trip and see what lessons humility might offer. You've come here chasing deodorants, but instead you find tension. Because tonight, you're walking alongside one of the most complicated, stubborn, and fascinating characters in the story of ancient Indian sexuality, the celibate. Ah yes, brahmacharya, the vow of chastity, the sacred commitment to a life without sex, without pleasure, without all those earthly distractions that tie us to the body and chain us to the endless cycle of rebirth. At least that's the theory. In practice, it's a little messier. You duck under a low-hanging branch and follow the trail toward an ashram, a simple structure built from stone and clay nestled beside a quiet stream. A group of young students, all in saffron robes, sit in a circle around a bearded guru. He's explaining the importance of self-control, how conserving sexual energy sharpens the mind and fortifies the spirit. He speaks of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, of detachment. His voice is calm, even rhythmic, like he's reciting something he's repeated for decades. And the students nod. Some are scribbling notes on palm leaves. One is clearly daydreaming, and another? Well, let's just say he's glancing at the pretty girl across the circle and not exactly hiding it. You smile, because you get it. This is the paradox of celibacy in ancient India. Revered, aspired to, structured, and almost always danced around with the clumsy grace of people trying very hard not to want what they very clearly want. The concept of brahmacharya has layers. Technically, it's just the first of 4 ashramas, life stages. It comes before marriage, before the householder phase, when you're supposed to study, focus, and prepare your mind for a balanced adult life. In this context, celibacy isn't punishment, it's training. A cleansing of the lens through which you'll view the world. But for others, renunciates, monks, and forest-dwelling sages, it's a lifelong commitment, not just abstaining from sex, but from desire itself. Total inner detachment. You follow one such sage now, a wiry old man with a staff and a beard that could have its own mailing address. He doesn't speak much. He doesn't need to. His life is his message. No possessions, no attachments, no indulgences. He spends his days in meditation, his nights under the stars, and his thoughts somewhere between this world and the next. You sit beside him, and after a long silence he finally says, "Desire is a fire. Do you feed it or extinguish it?" And before you can answer, he closes his eyes and disappears back into stillness. Classic sage move. But let's not pretend the story ends there, because ancient Indian texts are full of, well, complications. Celibates who fall, or don't fall but stumble, or who claim to transcend desire and then find themselves in situations that suggest maybe transcendence is still buffering. Take Vishvamitra, one of the most revered sages in mythology. He vowed to conquer desire through meditation so deep it could shake the heavens. The gods, concerned by his rising power, sent Menaka, a celestial nymph, to seduce him, and it worked. He broke his vow. They made love. She bore him a daughter. And while some stories frame it as a moral failure, others suggest it was simply human, natural, maybe even part of a larger spiritual journey. There's another tale about a monk who meditated under a waterfall for 20 years, only to be undone by the glimpse of a woman bathing downstream. He returned to his ashram, confessed, and then wrote poetry about it. Beautiful, aching poetry that now sits in libraries wrapped in gold thread. And here's your fringe detail of the day. Certain tantric texts describe a reverse celibacy practice where sexual energy is deliberately aroused but not released. It's circulated, restrained, redirected through the chakras. The point isn't denial, it's mastery. But to the untrained observer, it still looks like someone's trying not to explode while pretending they've reached enlightenment. Modern scholars still argue over what brahmacharya really meant. Was it about physical abstinence? Or was it symbolic, more about moderation, mindful living, and not getting attached to any form of pleasure, not just sexual? Some say the word literally means walking with Brahman, the divine consciousness. In that reading, celibacy isn't about what you give up, it's about where you walk toward. But there were critics even back then. Some poets mocked the idea of forced chastity. One bard wrote about a monk who scolded dancers by day but watched them secretly by night. Others questioned whether suppressing natural urges created more suffering than it prevented. After all, a fire ignored doesn't always go out. Sometimes it burns the house down. You sit now by the river with a group of former renunciates, men and women who gave up the path after realizing they didn't want to live in permanent denial. They tell stories of ashrams where passion bloomed behind meditation halls, of crushes disguised as mentorship, of nighttime rendezvous rationalized as testing willpower, and of the incredible guilt that followed when the ideal of purity collided with the reality of longing. But they don't speak bitterly. They laugh, they sigh, they say, "We were young, we thought we could erase our humanity. Turns out, the soul doesn't work like that." And you wonder, was celibacy ever meant to be perfect, or was it always just a practice? A process of learning what stirs your spirit and what enslaves it. For some, abstinence opens clarity. For others, it breeds hunger. The line between discipline and denial is thin and slippery. As the sun dips behind the trees, you walk back through the forest, listening to the rustle of leaves and the last bird calls of the day. You think about all the people who've tried to climb out of their desires, who've wrapped themselves in silence hoping to silence their needs, and you feel something tender, not pity, not judgment, but respect. It's hard to say no to the world, harder still to do it with honesty. Maybe the lesson isn't that celibacy is right or wrong. Maybe the lesson is that desire is complicated. And whatever path you walk, through pleasure or restraint, what matters most is whether it brings you closer to yourself. You're inside a modest home now, nothing grand or sculpted in stone, just cool mud walls, woven mats, and shelves lined with jars. Some are filled with herbs, others with strange oils or powders that shimmer faintly in the light. A mortar and pestle sits in the corner, still damp with crushed roots, and hovering nearby, like some ancient apothecary spirit, is an elderly woman with silver hair braided tight and eyes that have definitely seen more than one scandal bloom into a medical emergency. Welcome to the quiet, earthy world of Ayurveda and aphrodisiacs, where sex wasn't just a mystery or a metaphor, it was a matter of health. You've heard whispers of it before. The Kama Sutra with its perfumes and oils, the tantric rituals with their sacred herbs. But this is the underlayer, the everyday application of sexual wellness as an integrated, studied, respected science. Because in ancient India, desire wasn't just indulged, it was managed, carefully, systematically, like watering a plant with the perfect balance of sun and shade. The woman beckons you over. She hands you a small bowl with a dark, syrupy concoction. Sweet, spiced, oddly warm even though it's room temperature. Ashwagandha, she says, takes the tiredness out of your bones, puts fire in your blood. She says it casually, like she's not describing one of the most popular natural aphrodisiacs in the subcontinent for over 1,000 years. And this is just the beginning. You're about to learn that Ayurveda, India's ancient medical system, isn't just about balancing your doshas or detoxing your liver. It also contains an entire branch of study called Vajikarana, the science of virility and sexual rejuvenation. Not some sketchy back-alley potion peddling, but a codified discipline with recipes, treatment plans, and lifestyle regimens aimed at making your sex life healthier, longer-lasting, and spiritually aligned. You flip through an old Ayurvedic scroll. One section lists herbs and minerals that enhance sexual stamina. Kapkachu, Gokshura, Shatavari, literally she who possesses 100 husbands. Subtle, right? And Safed Musli. Another section talks about specific foods. Ghee, almonds, milk, sesame oil, honey, not because they're sexy, but because they nourish the tissues, especially reproductive tissues, which in Ayurvedic theory are the most refined layer of your bodily essence. You don't just eat for energy, you eat for oyas, a kind of luminous, life-sustaining vitality that flows through your fluids, and yes, that includes your semen and vaginal secretions. Welcome to holistic erotica. Now, let's get fringe for a second. Some older texts recommend things that are, let's say, more challenging to modern sensibilities, like preparing herbal infusions using the horns of certain animals, or brewing tonics with gold leaf. Yes, real gold. Was it placebo, possibly? Was it luxury? Definitely. But the point wasn't just biology, it was alchemy. The idea that the sexuality could be elevated, turned into something potent and divine through balance, ritual, and just a dash of glittering extravagance. You move through the inner room where another practitioner, this time a male healer, is preparing oils. He invites you to witness a couple's consultation. A husband complains of fatigue. The wife speaks of emotional distance. The healer doesn't raise an eyebrow. He nods thoughtfully, asks about their diet, their sleep patterns, even their arguments. Then, without judgment, he suggests not just herbs, but behaviours. He recommends nightly foot massages with Brahmi oil, listening to love poems before bed, eating together without discussing work, and yes, taking specific decoctions to restore desire. It's not just clinical, it's intimate medicine. You realise something that modern medicine often forgets, that sexual health is emotional, spiritual and environmental, not just mechanical. That tiredness, disconnection, anxiety, resentment, these things dull desire faster than age ever could, and that maybe we're not supposed to just fix libido, maybe we're meant to nurture it. As you leave the clinic, a younger apprentice stops you. He's studying to become a Vajrakarana specialist, and he tells you about one of the lesser-known Ayurvedic texts that includes not only aphrodisiac recipes, but instructions on posture, clothing, and even time of day for ideal lovemaking. Early morning, too sleepy. Afternoon, too sweaty. Late evening, just right, provided you've oiled your scalp, washed your feet, and recited the appropriate invocation to Kama, the god of desire. And yes, that's a thing too. Sex here isn't just physical, it's ritual. You purify yourself, prepare the room, light a lamp, maybe even place fresh flowers on the pillow. This isn't luxury, it's alignment. The idea is that when you treat your partner with this level of intention, the act itself becomes a form of healing, a ceremony. Naturally, the scholarly world has some opinions. Some argue that much of Vajrayana was limited to the elite, kings, nobles, those who could afford endless almonds and powdered pearls. Others point out that rural folk medicine also preserved these traditions in simpler forms, herbs boiled over open fires, chants passed down through grandmothers. The deeper question still lingers. Was this truly empowerment? Or just another way to control and optimize sexuality under the guise of health? The answer? Maybe both. As always. But there's no denying the integration. In this world, sexual health isn't carved off from everything else. It's not a side quest. It's connected to digestion, to sleep, to joy, to anger, to love. You can't just take a pill and expect your body to bloom. You have to tend the whole garden. You return now to the kitchen, where the older woman is stirring something fragrant in a copper pot. She smiles knowingly. You want the heart to open, she says. Sweeten the tongue, oil the skin, rest the eyes, then see what follows. You leave with a pouch of herbs, a handwritten recipe for a tonic, and the quiet sense that maybe your ancestors knew something we've forgotten, that pleasure and health were never meant to be enemies, that the body, when treated like something sacred, responds in kind, with warmth, with openness, with life, and maybe, just maybe, with love. You step into a room with low ceilings and thick drapes, the kind of space where everything feels closer than it should, closer to your skin, your thoughts, your limits. Candles flicker unevenly along the walls, throwing shadows that don't always match the movements around them. Someone laughs, a sharp, mischievous sound, and it's clear you're not in a temple tonight. You're in a space where the sacred steps aside and makes room for something older, rawer. This is the world of kinks, taboos, and the desires that lived in the margins of ancient Indian society. You've spent the last few chapters exploring desire in its sanctioned forms, divine unions, Ayurvedic tonics, carefully carved temple scenes. But now you're looking at the stuff that made people whisper. And whisper they did. Even in a culture as erotically open as ancient India's, not all desires came wrapped in marigolds and spiritual metaphors. Some came in sideways glances, in the dark corners of literature, in jokes layered deep in plays, in scrolls tucked behind more respectable manuscripts. Because where there's passion, there's also curiosity. And where there's curiosity, there are always a few people asking, but what if we tried this? The first thing you notice is how much is implied in the ancient texts. The Kama Sutra, for example, is often thought of as a neat little catalogue of positions and poetic metaphors. But buried within its more respectable advice on courtship and kissing is a chapter that deals, rather boldly, with unusual acts. The Sanskrit term used is oprashtaka, which scholars interpret to mean oral sex, not condemned, not erased, just there. Quietly acknowledged, described, advised upon, with a level of calm that puts most modern conversations to shame. In fact, the text provides guidelines for people with specific tastes or challenges, people who might prefer roleplay or who become aroused by unusual smells or who like being dominated. There's even mention of biting, scratching and artificial devices, though the materials used aren't exactly sold at your neighbourhood adult store. The language stays polite, but make no mistake, someone, somewhere had already thought it all through. You slide into a private chamber now, where a small group of people sits cross-legged, listening to a poet recite verses in Prakrit, a softer, more emotional cousin of Sanskrit. The verses are rich, layered, and once translated, wildly suggestive. A woman writes to her absent lover about her desire to be tied with jasmine garlands. A man confesses that he likes being shouldered before being touched. The room nods, not in judgment, but in recognition. These aren't shameful secrets, there are intimacies shared like recipes or lullabies. And here's your quirky detail. One ancient play, attributed to a lesser-known dramatist in the post-Gupta period, features a character who moonlights as a pleasure consultant. His job? To help married couples spice things up by suggesting role-plays inspired by mythology. Want to pretend you're Shiva and Parvati arguing on a mountaintop? There's a whole script. Want to reenact Krishna hiding the gopis' clothes? Just bring a flute and a sense of humour. But of course, not everyone in ancient India was down for the adventure. Some texts, especially the more orthodox Dharma Shastras, laid out strict codes about what was natural or what was lawful, and what was just a slippery slope to spiritual ruin. Positions were discussed, preferences judged. A few desires, especially those involving same-sex love, power reversals, or bodily fluids, were sometimes labelled as lower or impure. But even here the line wasn't always clear. What one text condemned, another celebrated. The push and pull of erotic freedom and moral regulation played out across centuries, never quite tipping one way or the other. You walk now into an artist's quarter where stoneworkers and painters joke while finishing a panel for a local temple. One of them is carving a woman mid-orgasm, her toes curling, her eyes closed in ecstasy. Another has drawn a scene where lovers are playing a game of dominance, one blindfolded, the other smirking. For the outside wall, the artist says with a wink. You don't hide the truth, you let it greet the pilgrims first. And that's the thing, taboo doesn't always mean forbidden. Sometimes it just means reserved. Set aside, whispered, not because it's dirty, but because it's potent. Dangerous even, like fire. You meet a priest later, younger than you expect, who leans in during conversation and tells you, we don't demo their things, we just don't shine a torch on them. Desire is like a serpent. It lives in the dark and moves best when it's not watched too closely. This discomfort, this friction between openness and control, is where the scholarly debates crackle the loudest. Some argue that ancient India had no real taboo the way we understand it now, only contexts. That anything could be sacred if done ritually. That nothing was profane unless it harmed. Others push back, pointing out the layers of caste, gender, and religious authority that shaped who could express their desires and who was punished for them. Just like today, but the texts don't lie, neither do the carvings, or the songs, or the little handwritten manuals hidden in private libraries that describe the art of gentle bondage using silk, or the stimulation of specific pressure points with polished stones. There's too much evidence to pretend this was a culture of abstinence wrapped in incense. You wander through a night market on your way out of this shadowy journey. A woman sells perfumed oils, each with names that sound more like feelings than fragrances. Temptation, delay, beloved's return. A man nearby sells talismans to prolong pleasure and induce vivid dreams. You don't ask what kind of dreams, you already know. You step back into the open air and the world feels softer somehow. Not more innocent, just more honest. Because desire, in all its complicated forms, isn't an invention of the modern world. It's not new, not shameful, not deviant. It's ancient. It's part of the human fabric, threaded into the Vedas, woven through the court poems, etched into the temple walls, and whispered into the palm of someone's hand in a dark room centuries ago. And maybe that's the real truth, that even in a culture that honoured love with sculpture and scripture, there were still corners of the heart that didn't need a spotlight, just enough space to exist. You're in a bathing chamber now, tucked into the back of a well-to-do home. The walls are made of smooth stone, worn down by time and steam. A brass pitcher tips forward with a lazy splash, and the water flows over your hands like warm silk. It smells of turmeric, neem, and crushed rose petals. The light is soft, filtered through cloth panels overhead, and everything from the ivory comb resting on the window ledge to the tiny clay bowl filled with sandalwood paste whispers the same quiet message. Someone is getting ready to be touched. Tonight, you're stepping out of scriptures and myths and slipping into something more personal, the rituals of beauty, hygiene, and preparation for intimacy in ancient India. Because behind every poem of longing, every sculpted scene of union, every secret midnight rendezvous, was the quiet, intentional act of getting ready. Not just physically, but mentally, sensually, spiritually. There was an art to it, and a routine. You start with the bath, not a rushed 2-minute rinse, but a full ceremony. First, oils are massaged into the scalp, usually sesame or coconut, depending on the season. The idea isn't just to soften the hair, but to calm the mind. Then comes the body, lathered with a blend of gram flour, turmeric, and milk cream, gently exfoliating the skin until it glows. The water, heated over wood fires, infused with herbs, sometimes even cooled with lotus petals in summer. And when the bathing is done, someone, usually a close friend, a sister, or a servant, combs the hair, braids it, applies kajal to the eyes, and rubs fragrant oils along the wrists and behind the ears. It's not vanity, it's ritual presence, a moment to return to the self before offering the self to another. You wander into another room where a young bride-to-be is being prepared for her first night. Around her, older women are chattering, half teasing, half guiding. One hands her a mixture of betel leaves and spices to chew, partly for breath, partly as a mild stimulant. Another applies henna to her palms, the patterns winding like secrets around her fingers. She's nervous. They tell her to relax, to laugh, to lie still, and to let the body speak for her. It's all incredibly gentle. No fear, no shame, just readiness. And then there's scent. A whole science of it. Fragrances weren't just to smell good. They were strategically chosen based on mood, time of day, and even astrology. Jasmine for passion, vetiver for grounding, rose for emotional openness, musk for seduction. In fact, texts like the Ganda Shastra were entirely devoted to the making and blending of perfumes, not just for personal use, but as tools of emotional influence. You didn't just prepare your body, you prepared your atmosphere. Here's your quirky detail for the night. Elite lovers in certain courts were known to keep love chests, tiny boxes filled with personal care items, hair oils, perfumes, soft cloths for wiping sweat, pastes for refreshing the breath, even miniature mirrors carved from polished metal. Some were decorated with intimate poems etched along the inside, revealed only when opened. Imagine a lip balm that whispers verses every time it's touched. But cleanliness and sensuality weren't only for the wealthy. Even in village homes and modest quarters, there were small, consistent habits. Clay pots filled with cool water, neem twigs chewed to clean teeth, castor oil rubbed into the scalp once a week, soot used as eyeliner, and once in a while a full-body scrub with ash and lentil flour before a festival, or a private evening, or a secret meeting no one else would ever know about. You visit now a bathhouse attached to a temple complex, where both men and women attend, at separate disclaimers of course, to prepare not just for love, but for worship. Because in many traditions, especially those rooted in Bhakti or Tantric philosophy, approaching the divine required the same kind of attention you'd give to a lover. You cleanse, you scent, you dress in fresh cloth, you humble your body, then elevate it. Whether you're entering a lover's arms or a sanctum, the method is startlingly similar. You meet a perfumer next, an old man with hands stained from years of handling flowers, roots and resins. He speaks in scents, not sentences. Jasmine is for the night, he tells you, holding out a tiny vial. It opens after sunset like secrets. He lifts another. Cardamom for the breath, sandalwood for the neck, camphor for the wrists, so your pulse carries it. You ask how he learned all this. He smiles. From my grandmother. She said you should smell like something worth remembering. And now a scholar's debate. Were these rituals truly about desire, or were they simply about purity in the religious sense? Did women prepare their bodies for their husbands or for themselves? For tradition? For ceremony? The answer, as always, is layered. There were rules, expectations, cultural scripts, but within them there was also space, private space, for self-expression, sensuality, play. One text describes how a woman should dress before meeting her lover. Not too flashy, not too modest. Another advises men to wear soft linen robes freshly perfumed, and to approach their partners as one would approach a deity, softly, respectfully, with full attention. Imagine being taught that in health class. But of course there were extremes. Some ascetic communities believed in rejecting all bodily care. No bathing, no oils, no scent. They claimed it led to detachment. Others disagreed, arguing that to neglect the body was its own kind of indulgence, one that disguised ego as humility. In more erotic schools of thought, particularly certain tantric sects, the body wasn't just a shell, it was a vessel of beauty, a canvas for awareness. Caring for it was a form of devotion, whether to a god, a partner, or yourself. As the night deepens, you find yourself back where you started, in the bathing room, now dimly lit and humming with crickets from outside. The air smells of roses and old stone. A lover is preparing for someone's arrival. They smooth the sheets, adjust the lamp, sit still for a moment, eyes closed, breathing into their own body, not to change it, but to notice it. And you think, we often speak of love like it starts when two bodies meet. But in this world, love starts long before that, with the slow, quiet ritual of readiness, with the way we touch our own skin, the way we notice our breath, the way we decide tonight to make space for connection, not by accident, but by choice. You're in a scriptorium now, an ancient writing room with reed pens dipped in lamp black ink, palm leaf manuscripts laid out like sleeping animals, and the soft scratching of words being born. There's incense in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of dried neem leaves and wet clay. Tonight, you've stepped into the realm where lovers never truly die. Where their sighs and glances are pressed into parchment, where desire lingers in ink. This is the world of Sanskrit poetry and the literature of longing, where love was not only lived, but endlessly written, rewritten, and ritualized into art. You sit beside a young poet, hair tied in a topknot, lips moving silently as he composes a verse. He's not in a hurry. No one here is, because love, in this tradition, wasn't something to be rushed. It was to be savoured. Every syllable mattered. Every word had to match the emotion, the glance, the mood of the monsoon, the way the anklet jingled during a lover's slow retreat. The genre is called Sringara Rasa, the aesthetic flavour of erotic love. Not erotic in the purely physical sense, but in the grander, aching, emotionally intelligent way that only a culture drenched in poetry could pull off. It's the celebration of the moment before the kiss, the pause between footsteps, the breath that catches when your lover's name appears in someone else's mouth. It's not about climax. It's about anticipation. You read a verse from Kalidasa, perhaps the greatest classical poet of ancient India. In one stanza, a woman watches her lover's reflection in the river. In the next, she speaks not to him, but to the breeze that touched his skin. She asks it to carry her longing across the hills. And somehow you feel it, not in your brain, but in your ribs. In another scroll, the anonymous author writes, "Her hair fell like a question I couldn't answer. Her glance, a thief. My name, stolen from my own tongue." That's the magic of this literature. It isn't just description, it's invocation. These poets weren't writing love scenes, they were crafting entire emotional universes. And yes, some of them got very descriptive. You come across a collection of Prakrit verses, more relaxed, more colloquial than their Sanskrit counterparts. These are not royal, they are earthy, funny, bold. A lover describes the shape of a woman's breasts as the perfect weight for forgetting one's responsibilities. Another compares her thighs to the trunks of young banana trees, trembling as if with anticipation. It's affectionate, tender, and wildly, gloriously human. And here's your quirky detail for tonight. Some ancient love letters were written on leaves. Not just palm or birch bark, but actual perfumed petals. Yes, you heard that right. Scented love notes. You'd crush rose petals, dry them carefully, write with fine ink and send them tucked into the folds of a silk robe. If the letter faded, it didn't matter. The fragrance lingered longer than the words. Back in the scriptorium, the poet leans over and offers you a palm leaf fragment. It's worn at the edges, but the verse is still legible. It reads, "The moon knows what I cannot say. It watched me sleep in your arms and whispered nothing." You sit with that line for a long time, but this wasn't just an art for elites. Love poetry was sung in markets, chanted in temples, scrawled onto the walls of caravanserais, and embedded into plays and folk songs. It lived in every corner of society. Some of the most sensual verses come from Devadasis, temple dancers who wrote odes to the gods in a voice that was unmistakably that of a lover. Krishna wasn't just worshipped, he was yearned for. Shiva wasn't just feared, he was seduced. And then there's the literary world of the Nayika and Nayaka, the heroine and hero archetypes that guided much of classical Sanskrit drama and poetry. There were categories for them, based on mood, status, situation. The woman waiting all night for her lover, the one furious he's late, the one seducing him despite her own hesitation, the man who regrets, the one who boasts, the one who weeps in the dark after pretending not to care. Every type of desire was mapped, named, immortalized. Scholars still debate, were these poems mirrors of real relationships, or were they idealized fantasies, a way for poets to escape the rigidity of Dharma and cast through metaphors of forbidden love? Some argue these verses were rebellious, subtly critiquing social structures by centering female desire. Others believe they were rituals of longing, teaching people how to feel more deeply, how to speak the unspeakable through rhyme and rhythm. You walk now into a smaller room, a private chamber where a lover once sat by moonlight, scribbling words onto a palm leaf while listening for footsteps outside. The poem, half finished, is still there. I traced your absence into the silk of my robe, and when I reached for you, I found a poem instead. There's something sacred in that. How ancient India allowed love to be both literature and life, both sacred and sensual, both grounded and gloriously over the top. As you sit back down among the scrolls, the poet beside you nods and says, "In writing love, we preserve the parts of ourselves we fear time will erase." You know exactly what he means, because even now, thousands of years later, reading these verses feels like pressing your ear to the chest of someone long gone, and still hearing their heartbeat. So maybe the real love story isn't just between the poet and the lover. Maybe it's between the poem and you, the reader, the listener, the dreamer who lets a line written in the 3rd century slip quietly beneath your skin. You're in the jungle now, but not the dense, tangled kind. This is a quieter forest, almost curated by the gods themselves. Tall sal trees, open patches of filtered sunlight, and vines that hang like old stories waiting to be told. You hear the chirp of parakeets, the shuffle of monkeys overhead, and in the distance the rhythmic beat of a drum, not a war drum, something softer, playful. You follow the sound, stepping through foliage that smells of wet leaves and turmeric dust, until you find it, a small clearing ringed with villagers and travellers, all gathered for a parable performance. You sit cross-legged as the storyteller begins, no fanfare, no scrolls, just a voice, a smile, and a fan made of peacock feathers. She holds it in one hand like a scepter, twirls it slowly, and starts the tale of a snake who fell in love with a peacock. It's a love story, of course. But like everything in ancient India, it's not just about love. It's about sex, longing, temptation, and what happens when one's natural instincts rub up against another's refusal to be caught. Tonight, we're entering the symbolic world of animal metaphors and erotic parables, a surprisingly vivid and weirdly effective language that ancient Indians used to talk about things they couldn't always name out loud. Lust, power, seduction, rejection. All the messier parts of desire that couldn't be carved in stone or inked in palm leaves oars have found their place here, in the feathers, claws, scales and paws of animals acting suspiciously like people. You glance around the clearing. No one is shocked. No one is giggling. A 10-year-old sits beside a grandmother. A man with a priest's forehead marking nods along. Because everyone knows this isn't about animals, it's about us. You lean in as the storyteller continues. The snake, slithering, silent, intense, is desire embodied. The peacock, vibrant, proud, aloof, is beauty that knows its worth. The snake wants. The peacock dances. They circle each other over and over, never quite touching. In the end, the snake sheds its skin in sorrow, and the peacock offers one feather as a parting gift. No resolution, just longing, preserved. You ask the man beside you if these stories were common. He smiles. Every village has a version, he says. Sometimes it's a monkey and a mango tree, sometimes a bee and a lotus. We speak of animals because people get shy, but the animals, they say everything for us. He's right. You hear another story next, this time about a parrot who mimics his master's love poems until he accidentally seduces the neighbour's wife. She starts leaving fruits by the window, not for the man but for the bird. It's absurd, hilarious, but also kind of brilliant. Because underneath the feathers and laughter is a question that still feels fresh. Who really speaks our desire? Is it us, or just the voices we've been taught to repeat? Here's your quirky detail of the day. In certain tantric traditions, animal imagery was deliberately used to classify types of lovers. Men were compared to bulls, stallions, or hares. Women to does, mares, or elephants. Not as insults, as categories, practical ones. The idea was to match compatible lovers, not just physically, but emotionally and energetically. It's less which Disney animal are you, and more like sacred matchmaking with a dash of farm report. Back in the clearing, the children are now reenacting a story about a fish and a turtle. The fish is restless, always swimming toward new things. The turtle is steady, hiding inside his shell. They fall in love. It works for a while. Until the fish leaves, bored maybe, or hungry for movement. The turtle watches her go, doesn't chase. The moral? Don't fall in love with someone who lives in a different current. A kid says this out loud and the adults just nod. Not because it's cute, because it's true. You find another storyteller later, a much older man with a voice like gravel soaked in honey. He specialises in riddle stories, the kind that don't really end. He tells you one about a monkey who could only speak in verses. He falls in love with a tiger who only listens to silence. They spend years together, talking and not talking. No fights, no kisses, just tension. And then one day, the monkey writes a poem so quiet it disappears. The tiger finally hears him. The end. What does it mean, you ask? He shrugs. Depends on who you are. That's the thing about these stories. They don't come with instruction manuals. No footnotes. No based on a true story disclaimers. They're deliberately open-ended, rich in symbolism and tuned to the frequencies of whoever's listening. Which means some people hear sex, some hear love, some hear loneliness, and some hear all three, sextet like lotus petals. Scholars still argue over how these stories were used. Were they teaching tools, entertainment, secret messages between lovers, coded resistance to social norms, maybe yes to all? One theory suggests they were part of informal sex education, gently introducing concepts like consent, incompatibility, pleasure, and restraint through imagery that was playful but pointed. Another theory says these stories were emotional rehearsals, safe ways to feel things before you actually had to live them. You're not going to seduce a peacock in real life, but you might love someone who always dances just out of reach. And when you do, the story will already be waiting inside you, whispering what to expect. As dusk turns to night, the clearing empties. The drums fade, the last storyteller pours water onto the embers of the fire, and you're left with a heart full of animals and metaphors that don't quite leave when you tell them to. You realise something, sitting there under the trees. In a world that carved eroticism into temples and sang love poems in royal courts, there was still a need for stories that could slither, flutter and sneak in sideways, not because people were ashamed of desire, but because they knew its true shape was hard to describe. Sometimes the only way to say it was to not say it at all. You find yourself now in the training grounds of a warrior's palace, somewhere hot and dry, maybe the edge of a Rajput kingdom or a southern dynasty carved into the hillside. The air smells like sweat, sandalwood and oiled metal. Swords clash in the distance, horses stomp, and the rhythmic thud of wooden staffs meeting flesh echoes like a heartbeat through the dust. But you're not here for battle tactics tonight. You're here to pull back the curtain on a truth that history books like to skip. The sensual, secretive lives of warriors, soldiers and spies. Those who fought by day and found other kinds of combat once the sun went down. You watch a group of young warriors practicing Kalaripayattu, the ancient martial art from Kerala, graceful, dangerous, practically a form of dance. Their bodies are lean and tightly coiled, and the movements tell you what the history scrolls often don't. These people didn't just train for war, they lived in their skin with hyper-awareness. Every muscle, every breath, every eye flicker had meaning. And when you live that close to your body, desire isn't some abstract thing. It's immediate. It's present. It's part of the ritual. You're led to a smaller, shaded pavilion where older warriors sit cooling off with rosewater towels and spiced buttermilk. Someone cracks a joke about a princess who stole more swords than hearts, and laughter rolls like thunder. But then the conversation shifts. They begin to talk about vows, lovers left behind, oaths made in whispers. One man says, "You can't ride into battle with an untended heart." Another grunts and replies, "Or worse, a recently broken one." There's something unexpectedly tender here. You expect brute strength, bravado, chest-thumping machismo, but instead you find softness laced with danger. A kind of emotional economy where touches are rare and therefore sacred. Letters from lovers become talismans. Perfumed handkerchiefs are tucked into armour like protection spells. One warrior confesses he wears a silver ring not for fashion, but because it once belonged to the woman he nearly married, before he was called to the front. "Still smells like her," he mutters, and no one laughs. And then, there are the spies. Oh, yes, you didn't think espionage was free from eros, did you? In fact, some of the most skilled agents in ancient Indian kingdoms were trained seducers, disguised as dancers, healers, wandering monks or merchants. They infiltrated enemy camps not just with knives, but with charisma. The Artha Shastra, Kautilya's famous political treatise, doesn't just discuss statecraft and taxation. It openly recommends the use of agents provocateurs, including beautiful men and women trained to extract secrets through seduction. You meet one of these spies, or at least someone who claims to be. She's middle-aged now, retired, running a small tea shop that doubles as a gossip hub, but her eyes are sharp and her stories are sharper. She speaks of kings who are undone by a single lover's kiss, of generals whose pillow talk brought down entire campaigns. "Sometimes the sword is your hips," she says, sipping her tea. "Sometimes it's your swords after." She tells you about training in the arts of pleasure as power, how to read body language like a map, how to offer closeness without vulnerability, how to ask the right question at exactly the right breathless moment. Not to exploit, but to know. "Everyone tells the truth when they think they're being loved, Theo," she says. "Even gods." Back in the palace, you walk through a mural hall that shows the other lives of warriors. Between battle scenes and victory parades, there are paintings of men and women bathing together in lotus pools, wrapped in silks, laughing. A soldier lying on his lover's lap, eyes closed. A woman helping her husband remove his armour slowly, reverently as if undoing a sacred knot. These aren't decorative. They're affirmations, proof that even those trained to kill needed gentleness, maybe even more than most. Here's your quirky fringe detail for the evening. In some elite warrior cultures, newlyweds were kept apart the night after marriage, not as punishment, but as a test of self-control and restraint. The idea was that if a soldier couldn't endure one night of burning anticipation, he might not survive the delayed satisfaction of campaign life. But if he passed, the next night was said to be worth 1,000 lives. And then comes the academic debate. Some scholars argue that tales of warrior sensuality are exaggerated, added centuries later by bored poets trying to balance out bloodshed with beauty. Others argue these stories are absolutely authentic, and were simply edited out of mainstream history by colonial translators uncomfortable with warriors who cried, kissed, or collapsed in the arms of lovers after battle. But you've seen too much to doubt it now. The letters still exist. The poems, tucked into old manuals. The accounts of generals who built shrines not just to gods, but to their wives, to their partners. Even in one case to a soldier's comrade, his tentmate and lover, buried beside him. No grand epitaph, just one line carved in fading Sanskrit. "He held my sword, my shield, and my sleep." You sit now near the training grounds as night creeps in, the air cooling. The warriors are resting, some alone, some with arms draped over each other, in the easy familiarity of people who've faced death together. A young soldier writes a letter by firelight. You catch the words. "The scent of you still lingers in the folds of my turban. Every breath a battle. Every battle a return to you." It's hard not to feel something. Not just the heat, but the vulnerability of it all. That for every glorious conquest there was a quieter one. A lover waiting. A touch remembered. A name whispered before charging into the unknown. So maybe warriors didn't just fight for honour or glory or king and country. Maybe they also fought to survive long enough to return to love, however brief, however forbidden, however imperfect. And maybe, in those stolen moments between war and death, they lived more fully than the rest of us ever dared to. You're walking through a quiet compound now long past sunset. It's a monastery. Stone walls, flickering lamps, silence so thick it feels like velvet pressed against your skin. This isn't a place for cloistered detachment. Not entirely, not tonight. Because tucked away in these austere chambers is a softer truth. The monks here once debated not only the mind, but the mysteries of the body. You've arrived at the unexpected intersection of Buddhism, monastic life, and the whispers of desire. A place where celibacy was a vow, yes, but not always an easy one. The first thing you notice is the discipline, not just of the body, but of speech, of glance, of movement. The monks glide like ghosts, eyes lowered, feet light, and yet there's a hum beneath it all, like a story hiding under the floorboards. You're shown to a simple stone bench, and an older monk, thin, calm, with eyes that seem to have watched entire lifetimes come and go, offers you tea. Then, without ceremony, he says, "Desire is the first teacher, pain is the second." You sip and listen. In early Buddhist texts, the Vinaya Pitaka, the disciplinary code for monks, there are detailed rules about celibacy. And not just don't have sex, no, they go deep. Monks are instructed to avoid touching women or even looking too long. Baths must be supervised, beds should not be too soft. Dream emissions must be confessed. Some rules seem extreme, others startlingly relatable. One line reads, "Do not linger in places where women sing," because even music could stir something dangerous. But why such intensity? Because the Buddhist path was surgical. The goal wasn't moderation, it was complete liberation. And in that framework, desire, particularly sexual desire, was seen as a chain, sticky, binding. The monk was training to free himself from attachment, from ego, from the wheel of birth and rebirth. And nothing tugged at the ego quite like lust. Still, desire doesn't care about robes. You walk through a corridor where centuries-old graffiti is etched into the stone. Not sacred mantras, poems, little ones, some of longing, some of frustration, some unmistakably erotic. A monk once scratched this into the wall beside his cell. She passed like the breeze. I closed my eyes, but my body remembered. Another reads, "This silence is not without echo. There's an undeniable humanness in it. Not failure, just humanness." You meet another monk, young, twitchy, clearly battling something inside himself. He tells you about the kilesas, the defilements of the mind, lust, hatred, delusion. He's not ashamed of his struggle. It's part of the training. He says the body is like a wild ox, and every time he sees a woman, even just her ankle, he feels the reins strain, but he doesn't run from it. He watches it. "I am not that feeling, Yisawar," he says. "I am the watcher of it." And yet, there were exceptions. Wild, strange, beautifully messy exceptions. In certain tantric forms of Buddhism, especially in Vajrayana traditions that emerged in later centuries, desire wasn't the enemy. It was a tool, a force to be understood, harnessed, and transformed. You're shown an illustrated manuscript from Tibet, full of deities locked in passionate embrace, yab-yum father-mother figures engaged in union not for pleasure but for transcendence. In these practices, the merging of male and female principles was symbolic of the non-duality at the heart of enlightenment. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about alchemy. The male represented compassion, the female wisdom. When united, they became the awakened mind. A scholar nearby rolls out a scroll and chuckles. "You'd be surprised how many monks practice sexual yoga before breakfast," he says. "Only the most advanced, of course, and only under strict guidance. But yes, it happened." You blink. That's a far cry from "don't look at ankles." He goes on to explain that the path of renunciation wasn't one size fits all. Some schools leaned towards strict abstinence. Others embraced a more integrated path where desire wasn't suppressed but observed, transmuted or ritualized. Some monks took secret lovers. Some confessed it, others didn't. A few were expelled, a few were venerated. The line between heretic and enlightened was thin and always shifting. Here's your fringe fact. In some Buddhist legends, great masters were seduced by dakinis, female spirits or wisdom deities, who appeared in dreams or visions to test their attachment. If they resisted, they failed. If they embraced the union with awareness, they advanced. The lesson? Sex wasn't inherently wrong. Attachment was. You step into a private library next, dim and cool. One monk has collected a shelf full of writings labelled Kama Bhava, mood of desire. They're not erotic in the usual sense. No heavy breathing, no dramatic metaphors, but they are intimate, meditative. A monk describes how a single glance from a village girl derailed his meditation for 3 days. Another writes of feeling aroused not by touch, but by the sound of temple bells. These are not confessions, they're studies, observations. The same way you'd examine a rare insect or the shifting of clouds. No shame, just presence. And yet, the debate continues, then and now. Were monks hypocrites? Were the rules too harsh? Did suppression lead to perversion or liberation? Modern scholars still wrestle with it. Some argue Buddhism's approach to celibacy was more psychological than punitive, a kind of cognitive training. Others say it created a culture of guilt and silence around natural desire. You've now met enough monks to know it's not so clean. For some, celibacy brought clarity. For others, it brought torment. The path is the same, the footprints differ. As you leave the monastery under the moonlight, you pass a meditation hall where a lone monk sits, still as stone. His eyes are closed, but his face, peaceful. You can't know what storm he's weathering in there. Maybe none. Maybe one he's named and tamed. Maybe one he's still riding like a tiger. And you think celibacy isn't a wall, it's a mirror. And every monk, every seeker, sees something different in it. Temptation, power, peace, or just themselves, looking back. The ground beneath your feet changes. Smooth stone gives way to cracked pavement. The air feels heavier, less perfumed, more proper. And the colours? They've dimmed, no more vibrant silks or temple wall blushes. Instead, muted browns, stiff collars, and the sound of church bells where once there were conches. You've crossed a threshold now, left behind the fluid heat of ancient India's sensual world, and stepped straight into the chill of a colonial drawing room. Welcome to the freeze-out, where Victorian morality tried to scrub India's sexual soul clean. You sit at the edge of a 19th century hall in Calcutta. A ceiling fan whirs overhead. A British officer leans over his desk writing a report, not about trade or war, but about native indecency. He's referring to a temple in Khajuraho. Its walls covered with lovers twisted in divine embrace, and he doesn't like it one bit. He writes that such images are immoral, primitive and uncivilized. His pen scratches like he's doing the gods a favour. It's here you see one of the sharpest cultural collisions in history. Colonialism versus sensuality. The British East India Company didn't just bring spoil and gunpowder, it brought prudishness, lace-trimmed repression, and a deep discomfort with anything that didn't fit into a binary of civilized versus savage. India's ancient comfort with sex, its art, its poetry, its temples, its manuals was labelled obscene, dangerous, something to be erased. You visit a museum, late 1800s, where sacred sculptures are being locked away in basements. Some are chipped accidentally, others are boxed up and labelled ethnographic curiosities. Kama Sutra manuscripts are confiscated, translations are censored, whole temple sites are cordoned off or mysteriously closed. A British missionary writes that the temple art at Konark is the filthiest thing ever erected under the sun. Filth. That's the word they use for 1,000-year-old icons of pleasure, union and spiritual eroticism. And yet, behind closed doors, those same colonials, reading the Kama Sutra, ordering hand-copied editions for their private collections, whispering about the courtesans they visited and the dancers they paid to perform ancient rituals now stripped of meaning and repackaged as exotic entertainment. Because repression rarely walks alone, it's usually arm in arm with hypocrisy. You meet an Indian translator, 1890s, sitting at a printing press holding a carefully reworded version of the Kama Sutra. He's been forced to tone it down, replace specific terms with vague metaphors. It's not about censorship, he tells you with a half smile. It's about survival. To keep the text alive, he must bury it under Victorian lace. Meanwhile, schools begin to change. Textbooks omit the existence of ancient sexual philosophies. Religious leaders, hoping to appease colonial masters, start denouncing practices they once quietly upheld. A generation grows up never hearing the songs of the Devadasis, never seeing the temple carvings of lovers, never reading the verses where pleasure and wisdom walked hand in hand. The lights didn't go out. They were dimmed, on purpose. Here's your fringe detail. In 1860, the British passed Section 377 into Indian law, a rule criminalising carnal intercourse against the order of nature. It wasn't Indian. It wasn't based on any Sanskrit code or Vedic verse. It was lifted straight from British law and dropped like a frost blanket over centuries of sexual fluidity. Suddenly, desires that were once divine became deviant. Third-gender communities, respected for generations, were now criminalised, pathologised, erased from public life. And yet, resistance never stopped. You meet a Bengali poet who hides erotic metaphors in nature poems, a South Indian sculptor who smuggles sensual imagery into devotional work, carving yoni symbols under lotus flowers, a dancer in Madras who refuses to abandon the sacred gestures of temple performance. Even after they're declared indecent, their defiance is quiet, patient, but persistent. You visit a printing press hidden behind a sari shop where old manuscripts are being reprinted under fake names. One reads like a Kama Sutra for revolutionaries. Touch her as you would touch your own country, carefully, reverently, like it might break or bloom. The publisher says it's fiction, but the glint in his eye says otherwise. Scholars today still argue about how deep the damage went. Some say Victorian morality permanently rewired Indian culture, introducing a shame that hadn't existed before. Others argue that India's sensual soul was never destroyed, only hidden, waiting. That it retreated into shadows not because it was weak, but because it was clever. It knew how to survive repression, how to shapeshift, how to endure. You stand now before a broken sculpture, once part of a temple doorway, now stored in a colonial-era museum, missing its arms, its hips. The plaque beneath it says, "Unknown deity, origin unclear." But you can see the curves, the soft swell of a thigh, the trace of a yoni symbol beneath the damage. You know exactly what she was. She was worshipped once. And you wonder, what happens to a culture when it forgets its own body, when it's taught to look away from the mirror, to fold its desires into silence, to trade sensuality for shame? You walk back through the drawing room where it all started. The fan still spins, the desk is empty now, but the echoes remain, the ink stains, the bruises, and yet so does the pulse, faint but steady. Because even in the coldest freeze, something always survives. Buried under corsets and scoldings, under colonial courtrooms and missionary sermons, under the weight of judgment, a memory still flickers, of a time when sex was not sin, when pleasure was wisdom, and when to know the body was to know the self. That memory is still there, and it's waking up. You wake up to the sound of drums, slow, rhythmic, ancient, but alive. Somewhere a conch shell sounds, not to summon gods this time, but to welcome back something that was almost lost. You're no longer in the cold hush of colonial corridors. Now you're in a swirl of colour and contradiction, because this is modern India, and the sensual past you've followed for so many chapters is trying to return. This is a story of revival, repression, and the rebirth of a forgotten erotic culture. You walk through the streets of a contemporary Indian city, maybe Varanasi, maybe Bengaluru. On the surface, it looks like any other crowded, chaotic metropolis. Honking autos, chai stalls, glowing phone screens. But below the noise, something stirs. You pass a bookstore that has a discreet classics shelf, nestled between Gandhi's autobiography and Kalidas's Meghaduta. There it is, a new translation of the Kama Sutra, glossy cover, respectful font, no trace of scandal. You flip through. The positions are still there, sure, but the real pleasure is in the prose, the care, the reclamation. This isn't about shock value anymore. It's about reconnection. But let's not pretend it's easy. The scars of colonialism still show. Many families won't talk about sex. Some temples have covered their erotic carvings with white cloth during festivals. School textbooks still avoid the topic altogether. You speak to a university student who whispers that they learned more about pleasure from Netflix than from any teacher, parent, or priest. Another admits they didn't know what the Kama Sutra actually said until they were 25, despite growing up an hour from Khajuraho. The repression didn't vanish with independence. It evolved, twisted, dressed itself up in tradition and politeness. Conservative forces, religious and political alike, continue to gatekeep sexuality behind layers of modesty and misinformation. And yet, even so, the reawakening is undeniable. You meet an artist in Jaipur who paints contemporary versions of old temple scenes, lovers mid-kiss, deities in embrace, but reimagined with queer couples, with disabled bodies, with skin tones and genders that don't match the old canon. His studio walls bloom with unapologetic love. "This is my worship," he says, mixing pigments. "My grandparents prayed in temples with these carvings. Why should I hide them now in Mumbai?" You sit in a circle with sex educators who teach workshops based on ancient Indian texts. But they're not quoting dogma. They're using the wisdom of Ayurveda and Tantric traditions to talk about consent, pleasure, and agency. One instructor laughs and says, "We're not here to tell people how to do it. We're here to remind them they can do it with joy and without shame." You visit a temple town expecting to find silence about its sensual past, but instead you stumble upon a small community theatre group performing a new play, a dramatic retelling of Radha and Krishna's courtship. It's bold, flirty, sensual in the most sacred way. No one giggles, no one walks out, parents clap, children stare wide-eyed, and just like that, what was once hidden is now centre stage again. Still, there are pushbacks. You attend a lecture where a conservative pundit rails against moral decline. He accuses artists and educators of misrepresenting our sacred texts, calls modern sexual freedom a Western infection. In ancient times, he says, we were pure. But you know better. You've walked through stone walls that prove otherwise. You've read the poems, sat with the monks, talked to the dancers, the sculptors, the lovers whose names never made it into the history books. And you want to ask him, what part of longing do you call impure? Here's your quirky detail. There's now an academic journal devoted entirely to studying the erotic in Indian history. Published not in the West, but in India. Its contributors include scholars, artists, activists, even a few priests. One recent article traced the symbolism of the yoni in tribal folk songs sung by women during harvest. Another explored how menstrual rites were once seen not as impure, but as deeply sexual and sacred. The archives are growing, the silence is cracking, and then you find yourself in Khajuraho again, that ancient temple town, but this time, you're not the only one studying the carvings. There's a group of students with sketchbooks, a tour guide who talks openly about the different moods of desire, a couple taking selfies with a sculpture of a celestial nymph mid-wink. The carvings haven't changed, but the gaze has. It's no longer voyeuristic, it's reverent, playful, proud. A local vendor tells you, "My grandfather covered the walls during festivals. My father ignored them. Me? I sell postcards of them." He holds one up and shrugs. "This is our history, not dirty, just human." You end your day in a rooftop cafe, the city lights flickering below. A poet is reading from their new collection, modern verses that echo the old Sringara rasa. They read, "She came to me not as a storm, but as the rain after drought. Not to drown, but to grow, and the crowd exhales. Not a cheer, not a gasp. Just breath, relief, recognition. Because this is what the rebirth looks like. Not a parade, but a return and a slow, tender unfolding of what was never truly dead. Just buried, covered, dimmed, and now lit again from within." You close your eyes for a moment. Behind your lids you see flashes, sculpted thighs, scented oils, love letters on petals, monks whispering poems into stone, warriors resting in a lover's lap, snakes and peacocks circling each other beneath a burning sky, and you realise something simple and maybe a little profound. The body remembers, the culture remembers, even when forced to forget. The truth of desire waits. And now, it's coming home. You wake once more, this time not in a temple or forest or candlelit study, but in a mirror. Not a metaphorical one, a real mirror. Modern, clean-edged, hanging above a bathroom mirror and sink in a home that could be anywhere. The reflection staring back at you is the same, but your eyes feel heavier, wiser. Because tonight, you've walked through the secret corridors of desire in ancient India, and now, here, you're standing at the last door, the final glimpse, the quiet bow. This is the moment we ask, what did all of this really mean? You think back to where it began, Khajuraho, the Kama Sutra, the playful dances of Krishna and Radha. You remember the temples where stone lovers embraced for eternity, the poetry that lingered in the air like perfume, the tantric rituals that turned sex into soul work. You remember monks struggling in silence, warriors whispering in tents, dancers dedicating each gesture to gods and lovers alike. You remember the intimacy of preparation, the hair oils, the scented baths, the soft cloth folded just right. You remember the animal metaphors, the poetry scratched into monastery walls, the scrolls hidden under saris and behind teacups during colonial crackdowns. You remember how every layer of Indian life, sacred, sensual, domestic, political, was touched by this thing we call desire. And you start to realise ancient India didn't just tolerate sex, it understood it. As force, as mystery, as teacher. Sex wasn't just about the act. It was a mirror of the universe, the union of opposites, the dissolution of boundaries. The meeting point between earth and sky, self and other, God and mortal. Their body wasn't something to escape. It was something to enter with reverence. You're standing now in a museum. Not a real one maybe, but one made of memory. Each gallery is a room you've walked through in the past 24 sections. In one, sculptures shimmer with remembered sweat and stone. In another, scrolls rustle with laughter and confession. A third holds nothing but perfume and shadows. And then there's the gallery of what was lost. The stolen manuscripts, the silenced poets, the temple walls whitewashed by shame. You pause there longest because it hurts to. Because it's not just about colonialism or censorship. It's about the way a culture was taught to doubt its own body, to fear what once made it powerful, but then you turn the corner. There's another gallery, one still being built. Inside it you find modern poets quoting ancient verses, dancers reclaiming Devadasi lineages, lovers of every gender and shape and status, rediscovering that sex, when done with care, is not just a rebellion, it's a return, a remembering. You smile, because you know now, desire isn't linear. It's cyclical. It hides, it re-emerges. It sleeps, it wakes. It gets misnamed, misused, misunderstood, but never extinguished. Not really. Even in its most sacred form, desire was never about ownership, it was about presence. Two beings, equal, awake, and unashamed. Touching not just skin, but story, breath, meaning. And this is your final fringe fact. In some rural regions of India, even today, there are folk tales passed orally, never written down, where lovers become stars after death, watching over the night sky. Their union, their pleasure, so intense, so right, that it left a mark on the cosmos. No scripture needed, just legacy, celestial graffiti. You take a deep breath, the mirror is still there, the reflection unchanged. But something inside you shifted. Maybe you've started to see the lineage of love, not as something broken or foreign, but as something inside your own bones. Maybe you'll never look at a sculpture, a verse, or even a quiet moment with your own lover the same way again. Maybe you'll remember that even in a world that taught you to hide your desire, someone, somewhere, once carved it in stone, bold, unashamed, eternal. So here you are, modern, mortal, messy, curious, and behind you 1,000 lovers whisper, so now you're lying there, eyes half-lidded, the weight of centuries settling gently onto your chest like a silk blanket. You've wandered through temples, kissed through poems, bathed in rose-scented oils, and eavesdropped on pillow talk that echoed across dynasties. Not bad for one night in bed, huh? But here's the real magic. This story wasn't just about ancient India. It was about you, your curiosity, your questions, your quiet wondering about what came before the shame, the awkward diagrams in textbooks, the cultural hush. And what you found wasn't some lost paradise, it was a complex, layered, sometimes contradictory world where desire was sacred, structured, celebrated, and yes, a little weird. And maybe that's what makes it so human. Desire didn't arrive with modernity. Pleasure didn't start with streaming apps or awkward health class videos. Sex didn't need to be invented by anyone. It's always been there, hidden in temple walls, sung under monsoon skies, passed hand to hand on lotus petals. What ancient India knew, and what it's slowly teaching us again, is that there's nothing small about intimacy. It's a portal, a practice, a pulse. So wherever you are, city or countryside, old or young, partnered or peacefully alone, just remember, the conversation never really ended. It just got quiet for a while, and now it's waiting for your voice, your touch, your story. Now go ahead, let your breath settle. Let the night hold you, and if you dream of peacocks and jasmine and half-finished poems scratched into stone, you're exactly where you're supposed to be.